There is a particular kind of silence that settles over Normandy in the early hours of a June morning. The fields lie still. The hedgerows hold their dark shapes against a sky not yet committed to light. The villages are quiet, stone walls, narrow roads, the faint smell of the sea carried inland on cool air. If you stand there now, in that stillness, it is almost impossible to reconcile what the ground beneath your feet once absorbed. Because in the summer of 1944, this quiet corner of northern France became the site of one of the most consequential military campaigns in human history. And at the very center of that campaign, dug into the orchards, moving through the lanes, counterattacking across the fields, were soldiers belonging to one of the most studied, most controversial, and most misunderstood military forces of the entire Second World War. This is the complete story of the Waffen-SS at Normandy. Not a celebration, not a myth, a reckoning. We are going to follow these formations from their origins as a small ceremonial bodyguard, through their transformation into an armored force of genuine battlefield power, all the way to the beaches and bocage of Normandy, and then beyond, to the encirclement, the catastrophe, and the collapse. We will follow the men who commanded them, the soldiers who served in them, the Allied forces who fought and died against them, and the French civilians who suffered at their hands. We will not look away from any part of that story. And if this is your first time spending a long night with a documentary like this one, welcome. You are in exactly the right place. Settle in, find your comfort, let the weight of the day begin to lift, and let the past, for a few hours, speak for itself. Now, before we get to the beaches, before we get to the panzers, and the hedgerows, and the pocket that nearly destroyed an entire army group, we need to understand something important, something that is often lost in the popular telling of the Normandy story. The Waffen-SS at Normandy was not a single force acting in unison. It was a collection of distinct formations, different divisions, with different histories, different commanders, different equipment levels, spread across the German defensive position in France, like pieces on a board that no single hand fully controlled. Some of those formations had been forged in the cauldron of the Eastern Front, veterans of Kharkov and Kursk who had survived conditions that broke lesser units entirely. Others were newer, built around a core of experienced officers, but filled out with recruits who were, in some cases, barely old enough to shave. One division, the 12th SS Panzer, became infamous not only for its tactical ferocity, but for the age of the soldiers who carried its rifles. Teenagers, boys who had grown up inside a state that had consumed their entire childhood and pointed them, at the end of it, toward a beach in France. That detail alone, the youth of those soldiers, has fascinated and disturbed historians for 8 decades, because it forces a question that has no comfortable answer. What do you do, as a historian, as a narrator, as a human being, with a formation that was militarily formidable and morally criminal at the same time? How do you hold both of those things at once, without collapsing one into the other? This documentary will not resolve that tension. It will sit inside it, because the history demands nothing less. Here is what is undeniable. When the Allied armies came ashore on the 6th of June 1944, they did not find a broken enemy waiting to surrender. They found, in many sectors, a defense of extraordinary tenacity. The reasons for that tenacity were multiple. The ground favored the defender. Allied coordination was imperfect in places. The German command structure had advantages that the chaos of the first hours could not entirely erase. But part of the explanation, an honest part, is this. The Waffen-SS divisions that moved to meet the invasion were genuinely dangerous. trained hard, led aggressively, armed with some of the most capable armored equipment then in existence. And yet, and this is the other half of the story, they lost. Not immediately, not cleanly, not without extracting a terrible cost from the Allies who pushed them back. But they lost. By the end of August 1944, what had entered Normandy as a powerful armored force had emerged from the Falaise pocket as a collection of broken remnants, streaming east with a fraction of the men and almost none of the armor they had carried into the campaign. The divisions that had arrived in Normandy as some of the most formidable ground formations in the German order of battle crossed the Seine River as shadows of themselves, bled white by weeks of attritional combat against enemies they could not replace and could not escape. That arc, from power to ruin, from the confident assembly areas of May 1944 to the catastrophe of the Falaise Gap, is one of the great military stories of the entire war, and it has never been more relevant to understand, because the battle for Normandy was not just a military event. It was a pivot point, the campaign that broke the Western position of Nazi Germany, that opened the road to Paris and then to the Rhine, that demonstrated, at enormous cost, what Allied material superiority and air dominance could do to even the most battle-hardened ground forces when the conditions were finally right. Over the next 18 chapters, we will walk through every stage of that story. We will spend time with the grand strategic picture, the arguments between Rommel and von Rundstedt about where to position the armor, the paralysis at Hitler's headquarters on the morning of the invasion, the ultra-intelligence that gave Allied commanders a window into German intentions, and we will come down from that level, all the way down, to the small unit fighting in the hedgerows, the burning tanks in the Odon corridor, the command posts that had to be abandoned every few hours, because Allied naval gunfire had found the range again. We will talk about what happened to Canadian prisoners in the first days of the campaign. We will talk about what happened to French civilians along the route of Das Reich's march north. We will talk about the post-war trials and the men who answered for those crimes and the ones who did not. That accounting is part of this story, inseparable from the military history, and it will be told with the seriousness it deserves. But we will also tell you about the moments of genuine military drama, the armored thrust that came within reach of breaking through at Epsom, the massive carpet bombing that tore open the German line at Cobra, the desperate stand at Hill 317 that helped seal the fate of an entire counterattack. These are stories that reward close attention. They are stories with shape and consequence, stories where individual decisions, made by exhausted men in the dark, echoed for decades. If you are watching this late at night, if the room is quiet and the world outside has gone to rest, you are in the best possible company for a story like this one. Long-form history, told carefully, is one of the most powerful things the human mind can settle into. There is something about the dark, about stillness, about the hours after midnight, when the noise of ordinary life falls away, that makes the past feel close, real, worth understanding. So here is what we ask of you. Stay with us. If you are new to this channel, this is the kind of documentary we make. Thorough, honest, grounded in the evidence, unwilling to cut corners. Subscribe if this is the kind of history you want more of, and then settle in, take a breath, and let the story begin. Because somewhere in Normandy, the fields are still quiet, and what happened in them deserves to be remembered. Before the soldiers ever reached the beaches, before the tanks moved north through the lanes of Normandy, and the guns opened up across the hedgerows, there was an idea. Not a military idea in the conventional sense, not a doctrine drawn up in a war college, or a formation shaped by centuries of national tradition, but something far more deliberate and far more dangerous. The force that Allied planners would eventually confront in the fields and villages of northern France had been built from the ground up to embody a political vision, to serve as its armed expression in the most literal sense. Understanding what that force was and how it came to be requires going back to the earliest years of the regime that created it, to a time when it numbered not in the tens of thousands, but in the dozens. In the late 1920s, Heinrich Himmler was given charge of what was then a modest protective detail attached to the Nazi Party leadership. It was called the Schutzstaffel, the Protection Squadron, and its original purpose was exactly what the name suggested: personal security for senior party figures, Adolf Hitler above all. At the time, the SA, the far larger paramilitary organization of the movement, dwarfed it in numbers and in visibility. The SS was a subordinate element, small enough to be overlooked, precise enough to be trusted. Himmler, a man whose administrative ambitions ran far ahead of anything his physical appearance suggested, began quietly transforming it. He imposed selection criteria based on racial ideology, demanding documentation of ancestry and physical standards that turned recruitment into a ritual of ideological conformity. By the early 1930s, the SS had become something distinct from the rest of the party apparatus: tighter, more ideologically coherent, and increasingly powerful within the internal politics of the movement. The purge of the SA in the summer of 1934 changed everything. With the destruction of the rival organization's leadership, the SS emerged as the dominant internal security force of the Reich, and Himmler's position became almost untouchable. It was in the years that followed that the idea of a militarized SS formation, one capable of operating on a battlefield alongside the Wehrmacht rather than merely guarding a headquarters, began to take concrete shape. The initial formations were small, trained to a high standard, and fiercely resistant to any suggestion that they fell under army command. This tension with the professional military never fully resolved itself. Wehrmacht generals looked at SS formations with a mixture of condescension and unease, questioning their battlefield competence while simultaneously resenting their political protection. The SS, for their part, regarded the army establishment with a suspicion rooted in ideology: too conservative, too aristocratic, too attached to the old Germany rather than the new one. The force that emerged from this friction was called the Waffen-SS, the Armed SS, and it occupied a peculiar position in the German military structure. Administratively, it remained under Himmler and the SS apparatus. Operationally, it fought under Wehrmacht command in the field, taking orders from army commanders who did not control its promotions, its replacements, or its internal culture. This dual nature created complications that persisted throughout the war. Waffen-SS divisions received preferential treatment in the allocation of equipment and replacements, a source of profound resentment among regular army formations that often went under strength while SS units were topped up. In return, those SS divisions were repeatedly committed to the most difficult sectors, used as a fire brigade when lines were collapsing, thrown into counterattacks that conventional wisdom would have pronounced hopeless. It was a relationship of mutual exploitation dressed up, on the SS side at least, in the language of ideological superiority. The training philosophy that shaped Waffen-SS soldiers was deliberately distinct from that of the Wehrmacht, where the regular army trained men to follow orders through a hierarchy of rank and discipline. SS training emphasized aggression, initiative at the small unit level, and a willingness to close with the enemy at close quarters, regardless of loss. Physical standards were demanding, and the ideological component was woven into everything, not as an occasional lecture, but as an ambient element of daily life in the formation. Young men were taught that they were not simply soldiers, but the racial and ideological vanguard of a new European order, a concept that had practical military consequences. It produced soldiers who were, in many cases, ferociously motivated. It also produced formations capable of atrocity, because the ideological framework that fired their battlefield aggression also stripped away the restraints that military convention and common humanity place on the conduct of war. These two qualities were not separate. They came from the same source. The war on the Eastern Front, which opened in the summer of 1941, became the crucible in which the Waffen-SS was forged into the force that Allied commanders would face at Normandy. It was in the vast distances and savage fighting of that conflict that the SS panzer divisions acquired their battlefield identity and their battlefield reputation. They fought with a ruthlessness that dismayed even some German officers, and they took casualties at a rate that would have destroyed less motivated formations. In the defensive battles of the winter of 1942–43, and again in the counterattack at Kharkov in the spring of 43, SS armored formations demonstrated a tactical proficiency that earned them genuine military respect. Kharkov, in particular, established a template. SS panzer divisions, used with aggression and concentration, could blunt a Soviet offensive and retake ground that conventional wisdom said was gone. That lesson was absorbed by German commanders, who increasingly reached for SS formations whenever a crisis demanded resolution, and by Himmler, who used battlefield success to justify further expansion. By 1944, the Waffen-SS had grown from its origins as a few hundred selected men into a force comprising scores of divisions, ranging from the elite armored formations that had earned their reputation on the Eastern Front to lesser quality infantry divisions assembled from conscripted ethnic Germans across occupied Europe. The distinction between these tiers was vast. The frontline panzer divisions were genuinely formidable military formations by any objective measure, well equipped, experienced, aggressively led, and possessed of an institutional culture that prized offensive action above almost everything else. The expanded SS of the later war years, padded with recruits from across German-occupied territory, shared little with those elite formations beyond the uniform. For the purposes of the Normandy campaign, it is the elite armored divisions that matter, the formations bearing names that would become markers on Allied operations maps throughout the summer of 1944. The question of why these formations were in France at all connects to broader decisions made at the highest levels of German strategic planning. After the disaster at Stalingrad in early 1943 and the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, it had become clear to most senior German commanders, though not, crucially, to Hitler, that the strategic initiative had passed to the Allies. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and then of mainland Italy confirmed what geography already suggested. The Western Allies would eventually strike at northwestern Europe. France was the obvious target, and the coast of France required defending. But the question of how to defend it produced a fundamental disagreement that would shape everything that followed. Some commanders wanted the panzers close to the coast, available to counterattack within hours of a landing. Others wanted them held back, beyond the range of Allied naval gunfire, to be committed in mass once the landing zone was confirmed. The SS panzer divisions sat at the center of this argument, the most powerful mobile reserve available, and therefore the most urgently contested piece on the strategic board. The men who commanded these divisions brought with them a particular kind of confidence, built on Eastern Front success and institutional self-belief. They had fought in conditions that would have broken ordinary formations, and many of them wore their scars openly, physically, and in the harder-to-see ways that years of violent command produce in men. They had faith in their soldiers and faith in their equipment, and most of them regarded the coming confrontation with the Western Allies with a calculation that was neither dismissive nor despairing. They knew a landing was coming. They knew it would be large. What they could not know, what no German commander could fully appreciate from within the intelligence picture available to them, was the scale of what was being assembled on the other side of the English Channel. They had fought the Red Army, which had resources that seemed without limit. They were about to fight something categorically different, an Allied force backed by material production on a scale that German industry, for all its remarkable achievements, could not match, and supported by an air force that had already demonstrated its ability to make daylight movement on roads a lethal undertaking. What Allied planners faced then was a force that combined genuine tactical excellence with a set of fundamental strategic vulnerabilities. The Waffen-SS divisions arrayed in France were among the best military units Germany possessed. They were also the product of an ideological project that had already committed atrocities across the Eastern Front and occupied Europe, and that carried within its institutional culture the seeds of further war crimes. These two realities cannot be separated in any honest account of the campaign that followed. The combat record and the criminal record are aspects of the same formation, shaped by the same training, the same belief system, the same willingness to regard the rules of war as constraints that applied to others. Understanding this is not merely a moral exercise. It is essential context for what happened in the villages of Normandy, to soldiers on both sides, and to the civilians caught between them. The summer of 1944 would test the Waffen-SS against an opponent unlike any it had faced before, lavishly equipped, commanded with growing operational sophistication, and fighting on ground where Allied air power could make itself felt with a consistency and weight that the Eastern Front had never produced. The story of what happened when these two forces met, the ideological elite of a crumbling empire and the industrial military power of an ascending alliance, is the story this documentary tells. It begins in the grey light of early June, with warships in the Channel and young men on both sides of a line, waiting for something none of them could yet see clearly. But to understand what those men were and what they would do, we must first understand what built them. That history is longer than a single night. It reaches back through years of war, years of expansion, years of ideology translated into organization, and organization translated into force. What arrived in Normandy in 1944 was the finished product of all of it, and its true test was about to begin. Along the northern coast of France, in the months before the summer of 1944, something enormous was taking shape. Concrete was being poured in quantities that strained the industrial capacity of an already exhausted empire. Steel reinforcing rods were shipped from foundries in the Ruhr, and tens of thousands of forced laborers moved earth and mixed mortar under the supervision of organization-taught engineers who worked to schedules that brooked no delay. The Atlantic Wall, as it had been named, stretched for thousands of kilometers from Norway's Arctic shore down to the Bay of Biscay, an ambitious, propagandistic vision of an impenetrable coastal fortress. In reality, it was something rather more uneven. Certain stretches were formidably prepared, thickets of obstacles below the waterline, concrete casemates housing heavy artillery, bunkers with interlocking fields of fire that could make a beach crossing into a killing ground. Other stretches were barely begun, defended by second-rate divisions holding impossibly wide frontages with insufficient ammunition and aging equipment. The wall was as much a political statement as a military structure, and the men tasked with defending it knew the difference. By the spring of 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt sat in Paris as Commander-in-Chief West, presiding over a command that stretched across occupied Western Europe with the calm authority of a man who had spent decades in uniform. He was methodical, aristocratic in bearing, and deeply skeptical of the wall's propaganda value. Von Rundstedt did not believe the Atlantic Wall could stop a determined Allied landing at its point of application. He had read his military history. Fortifications held only as long as they could be reinforced and resupplied, and the Allies possessed the naval and air resources to make coastal reinforcement a nightmare. His prescription was classical: hold a powerful mobile reserve far enough inland to be beyond the immediate reach of naval gunfire, allow the Allies to commit to a landing and reveal their intentions, and then strike the bridgehead with concentrated armored force before it could be consolidated. It was the kind of operational thinking that had served the German army well in the East, where distances swallowed mistakes and initiative could be rewarded with annihilating encirclements. Into this calculated arrangement stepped Erwin Rommel, appointed in late 1943 to inspect and then command Army Group B, responsible for the defense of France's northern coastline. Rommel brought with him a perspective shaped by North Africa, where Allied air power had taught him lessons written in fire and blood. He had watched entire armored formations destroyed from the air before they could reach the front, supply columns obliterated on roads that offered no cover, and tanks reduced to burning hulks by aircraft that operated with near impunity once fuel and ammunition ran short. The mobile reserve strategy, he believed, was a fantasy in the age of Allied air supremacy. A panzer division caught moving across open country by day would be shredded before it reached the battlefield. The only answer, in Rommel's estimation, was to fight the battle at the waterline itself, to stop the Allies on the beaches during the first hours, before they could land the weight of men and armor that would make them unstoppable. He threw himself into strengthening the coastal defenses with characteristic energy, ordering millions of obstacles placed in the shallows and on the beaches, demanding mines be laid in quantities that far exceeded what had previously been approved, and inspecting positions personally with an intensity that left subordinates exhausted. The argument between these two experienced commanders was not merely a disagreement about tactics. It was a dispute about the nature of the coming battle itself, and about which of two different wars they were actually fighting. Von Rundstedt was thinking in terms of a continental land campaign, where mass and maneuver would ultimately decide the outcome. Rommel was thinking in terms of a battle where Allied air power had already redrawn the rules, where the hours between landing and consolidation represented the only real window in which German arms could prevail. Both men were partly right, and their partial rightness made the argument irresolvable by the logic of command alone. The dispute was eventually escalated to Hitler, who resolved it in the manner most characteristic of his military leadership. He refused to choose clearly between them, splitting the available armored reserves in a compromise that satisfied neither commander and produced a deployment that served neither doctrine. 3 panzer divisions were allocated as an armored reserve positioned closer to the coast, notionally available to Rommel for the beach battle he envisioned. The remaining armored strength, including the powerful SS panzer formations, was designated as an Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reserve, meaning they could not be moved without Hitler's personal authorization. This arrangement placed some of the most powerful armored formations in France in a kind of suspended animation, parked in assembly areas across the Norman and Breton countryside, waiting for a release order that would have to travel from the frontline commanders up through layers of staff, across to the Führer's headquarters, and then back down again before a single tank could move toward the sound of the guns. In the abstract, this might have made strategic sense if Hitler could be relied upon to be alert, responsive, and willing to delegate. In practice, It introduced a delay into German decision-making at the precise moment when speed would be most critical. The Waffen-SS panzer divisions, waiting in France during this period, were not idle. They used the months of preparation for intensive training, maintenance cycles, and the absorption of replacements who had often come directly from Hitler Youth organizations. Without the Eastern Front experience, their officers and senior NCOs carried in every scar and every habit. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, formed only the previous year, was stationed in an area roughly 30 to 40 kilometers south and southeast of Caen. Its young soldiers cycling through exercises designed to harden them for the armored infantry fighting that was coming. The 1st SS Panzer Division Labstandart was positioned further east, part of the reserve pool. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich sat far to the south, near the city of Toulouse, its presence in that region partly a product of occupation duty and anti-partisan operations that had already marked the division with a reputation for brutality. These formations were powerful, but their dispersion across a wide geographic area was deliberate, the product of the same compromise logic that had paralyzed the armored doctrine debate. The positioning of these SS divisions also reflected a deeper uncertainty in German strategic thinking about where the Allies would actually land. The elaborate Allied deception operation, which built and maintained a fictional army group supposedly poised to strike at the Pas-de-Calais, had succeeded in introducing genuine doubt into German intelligence assessments at the highest levels. The Pas-de-Calais remained the logical choice in many German minds. It was the shortest crossing from England. It offered the most direct route into Germany, and the fictional radio traffic and dummy formations the Allies had constructed pointed there with apparently unmistakable clarity. Normandy was considered a possible secondary target, perhaps even a diversionary feint. This assessment shaped where German formations sat, and it shaped how commanders would interpret the first reports of the actual landings when they came, introducing a hesitation that the Allies had carefully engineered. Along the Normandy coast itself, the actual defenders were ordinary infantry divisions, many of them under strength, under-equipped, and leavened with soldiers who were anything but the ideologically committed volunteers that Waffen-SS recruitment mythology liked to project. There were divisions composed partly of men recruited from occupied Soviet territories, men fighting for Germany, not from conviction, but from circumstance. There were older men, men recovering from wounds, men who had been combed out of factories and offices as the manpower demands of a multi-front war stripped Germany of its younger generations. The coastal divisions held their positions and improved them as best they could, laying mines, stringing wire, registering artillery on the beach obstacles, and hoping that whatever was coming would come somewhere else. They knew, in the way that soldiers always know, that something was coming. The channel traffic, the radio intercepts that even frontline men sometimes heard rumors of, the sheer weight of Allied air activity over France. It all pointed toward a summer that would not be quiet. Rommel spent the final weeks of spring inspecting positions, arguing for more resources, and writing memoranda that acknowledged privately what no German commander could state publicly, that if the Allies achieved a secure lodgment and began landing the full weight of American industrial production onto French soil, the campaign in the West was probably already lost. He was convinced the first 24 hours of the invasion would decide everything. He pressed his case for armor at the beaches, with a tenacity that wore down his staff, and still could not extract the concessions from Hitler that might have made the difference. The SS Panzer divisions, the formations that might have turned a defended beach into a catastrophe for the Allies, remained positioned inland, their release tied to a command authority that could not be exercised at 3 o'clock in the morning, when reports were confused and orders took hours to clarify. On the 4th of June 1944, Rommel made a decision that would haunt the historical record for decades. Convinced that the weather conditions in the Channel made an imminent Allied landing unlikely, the seas were rough, the skies overcast, and German meteorologists had not forecast any improvement, he left his headquarters in France and travelled back to Germany to visit his family and then to meet Hitler at Berchtesgaden to press once again for additional panzers. He would not be at his command post when the paratroopers began dropping from the dark Norman sky 2 nights later. The Atlantic Wall he had worked so furiously to complete would face its test without its most passionate advocate standing ready to direct the battle he had spent months envisioning. The debate over where to place the armor, the compromise that satisfied no one, the reserve held back by a command structure that could not respond at the speed events demanded, these were not failures of individual courage or tactical skill. They were structural failures, embedded in the command arrangements of an army fighting at the end of a political leash. The Waffen-SS divisions sitting in their assembly areas on the 5th of June 1944 were among the most capable armoured formations in the world by the measure of their training, their equipment, and the hard experience of their veteran officers. Whether they would be able to use that capability depended on a telephone call that no one had yet made, to a man who was, for the moment, still asleep. By the spring of 1944, France had become a waiting room for some of the most powerful armoured formations the German military had yet assembled. The men who filled them were not fresh conscripts standing at barracks windows wondering what war looked like. Most of them already knew. They had come west, carrying the Eastern Front inside them, the frozen steppes, the burning villages, the mathematics of survival that only prolonged combat teaches. Now they sat in French chateaux and Norman farmhouses, maintaining their vehicles, running their training exercises, and watching the sky with a wariness that only men who had been bombed repeatedly ever truly develop. These were the divisions of the SS Panzer Corps, the formations that Allied planners privately acknowledged would be among the most dangerous opponents any invading force could face. Understanding who they were and what they carried into the summer of 1944 means understanding why the battle for Normandy would cost so much and take so long. The 1st SS Panzer Division, known as the Leibstandarte, occupied a place entirely its own within the structure of the Waffen-SS. It had begun as the personal bodyguard of Adolf Hitler himself, a ceremonial formation whose original function was prestige rather than combat. That origin had long since been overtaken by events. By 1944, the Leibstandarte was a full armoured division in every meaningful sense, battle-hardened across Barbarossa, across the brutal winter fighting on the Eastern Front, and across the vicious counterattacks around Kharkov in 1943 that had rebuilt German lines at enormous cost. The men of the Leibstandarte carried that history as a kind of institutional identity, a pride in having been present at some of the most demanding moments the German army had endured. It made them formidable. It also made them, in ways that would surface later in Normandy, capable of conduct that no military necessity could justify. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend presented a different, and in some respects, stranger picture. Where the Leibstandarte drew on years of accumulated combat experience, the Hitlerjugend had been formed barely a year before the Normandy landings, recruiting its rank and file almost entirely from the youth of the Hitler Youth generation, boys born in 1926 and 1927, who had grown up inside a system that made military service the center of their entire identity. What they lacked in battlefield experience, the division's commanders sought to compensate for through 2 mechanisms. First, a cadre of experienced NCOs and officers was drawn heavily from the Leibstandarte itself, men who had already survived multiple years of intense combat and who understood how to translate ideology into tactical competence. Second, the training program they imposed on these young recruits was relentless, physical, demanding, and deliberately designed to compress years of ordinary military development into months. The result was a division that, by the spring of 1944, had achieved a level of unit cohesion and technical proficiency that would have been difficult to predict from its origins. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, was stationed well to the south and west, in the Toulouse region of occupied France, far enough from Normandy that its road march to the fighting would become a story of its own when the invasion came. Das Reich had an exceptionally long combat history, having been committed almost continuously since the opening of the war in the West in 1940. It had fought in Yugoslavia, participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and had been one of the formations bled nearly to destruction in the grinding attritional battles on the Eastern Front. By 1944, it had been rebuilt and re-equipped, its strength restored to something approaching its theoretical establishment, though like all German armored formations at that stage of the war, it operated in a constant negotiation between what the tables said it should have and what the supply chain could actually deliver. The division's distance from Normandy would prove to be one of the most consequential geographical facts of the entire campaign. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, had spent much of the preceding period fighting on the Eastern Front and had been withdrawn to France specifically for rest and refitting. Both divisions had been worn down by the brutal tempo of operations in the East and needed time to absorb replacements, repair and replace equipment, and restore the organizational integrity that sustained combat had ground away. France, in the spring of 1944, was theoretically a place where this could happen. The two divisions were grouped together within the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, giving them a combined weight of armor that, on paper at least, represented a formidable striking force. Whether they would be ready when the moment came was a question that preoccupied their commanders as they watched the calendar move toward summer. Across all of these formations, the equipment picture was one of genuine capability, unevenly distributed. The Panzer Mark IV remained the most numerous tank in the SS inventory, a reliable and proven design that had been progressively up-gunned and up-armored through the war years, capable of engaging most Allied armor at reasonable combat ranges. But it was the Panzer Mark V, the Panther, that German commanders pinned their greatest hopes on. The Panther's long 75mm gun could reach out across the Bocage country and kill Allied armor at ranges that gave the defender a pronounced advantage. Its frontal armor was formidable by any standard of the period. The problem was reliability. The Panther had a history of mechanical difficulties that meant a significant percentage of any formation's tanks would be deadlined at any given moment, and spare parts were never as available as operational planning assumed they would be. The Heavy Tiger, present in smaller numbers within dedicated heavy tank battalions, attached to the corps rather than integral to the divisions, was similarly powerful and similarly demanding of maintenance resources that were always in shorter supply than required. Sepp Dietrich commanded the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and his presence is impossible to separate from any honest account of the Waffen-SS formations in France. Dietrich was not a conventional military figure in any recognizable sense. He had risen to high command not through a staff college education or a conventional officer's career, but through personal loyalty to Hitler and through a particular kind of brutal competence that the Eastern Front had authenticated in its own unforgiving way. Critics within the German military establishment, and there were many, regarded him with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment, unable to reconcile his lack of formal qualifications with the genuine fighting effectiveness his formations consistently displayed. What Dietrich understood, perhaps more intuitively than analytically, was the human dimension of command, how to maintain the loyalty of men who were being asked to do things that destroyed them, and how to translate that loyalty into tactical aggression when the moment required it. Fritz Witt, who commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was a different kind of officer entirely. Younger than Dietrich and considerably more formally educated in the military sense, Witt had built his reputation through a series of increasingly demanding commands on the Eastern Front, earning a recognition for personal courage and tactical intelligence that had brought him to divisional command before he was 40. His relationship with the young soldiers of his division was described by those who served with him as something between commanding officer and elder brother, a man who understood that what he was asking of boys who had barely finished their schooling was something that demanded a particular quality of human presence from him in return. The division he had built was, in the spring of 1944, a reflection of his own standards, technically proficient, intensely motivated, and carrying within it a set of values and conditioned responses that would produce both extraordinary tactical performance and conduct that history would not excuse. The internal culture of these formations deserves its own examination because it shaped everything that followed. Within the SS Panzer divisions, ideological formation was not separable from military training in the way it might have been in a conventional army unit. The men had been told, through years of conditioning that began before many of them ever put on a uniform, that they were members of a racial and political elite whose battlefield performance was an expression of something larger than military duty. This created a genuine fighting spirit that manifested as tactical aggression, a willingness to hold positions long after other formations might have withdrawn, and a capacity for improvisation under pressure. It also created a dehumanization of enemies that made atrocity not an aberration, but a plausible outcome of the logic these men had been given. The two things cannot be disentangled. The same formation that would hold a defensive line with extraordinary tenacity was the same formation capable of killing prisoners in cold blood and treating civilian populations with a violence that had no military explanation. Through the spring months, the divisions maintained an intensive training schedule. Regimental and battalion commanders conducted exercises that simulated the kind of mobile defensive battles that doctrine and experience suggested were coming. Mechanics worked through the maintenance backlogs that had accumulated during the journey from the east and the process of re-equipping. Junior officers studied terrain maps of northern France and the likely Allied approach routes. The men, particularly in the Hitlerjugend, ran through drills with a physical intensity that bordered on the punishing, driven by officers who had survived enough combat to know that what the exercises could not fully teach, the management of fear, the maintenance of function under artillery fire, the ability to keep thinking when everything around you is chaos, could only be approximated. They waited, they trained, they watched the sky when Allied reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead, and they understood that the watching was being done in both directions. What the Allies knew about these formations, and how they weighed that knowledge against their own capabilities, was itself a significant variable in the planning that was still being refined as the spring deepened into early June. Ultra-intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and agent reports had given Allied planners a reasonable picture of where the major SS formations were sitting and what their approximate strength appeared to be. The knowledge was imperfect, and the assessment of how quickly these divisions could move was, as events would demonstrate, both accurate in some respects and dangerously optimistic in others. The Germans, for their part, were still debating among themselves where the blow would fall and how their armoured reserve should respond when it did. A debate that, as the previous chapter explored, remained unresolved right up to the moment the invasion began. On both sides of that question, the SS Panzer divisions sat at the centre of the calculation, the force whose speed and weight of response would do more than anything else to determine whether the invasion held or was thrown back into the sea. Before the first grey light touched the Normandy coast, the sky had already broken open. Paratroopers from American and British airborne divisions were falling across the peninsula, into fields, orchards, church squares, and flooded lowlands. Flak batteries swung their barrels skyward. Telephone lines lit up across the German chain of command, as local garrison commanders scrambled to report what they were seeing, which, in most cases, was chaos they did not yet understand. The coastal radar network had been systematically degraded by Allied bombing in the preceding weeks, leaving German signals officers to piece together a picture from fragmentary ground reports and rumour. At the headquarters of Army Group B, the night duty staff began logging calls that did not add up to anything coherent. Scattered drops across a wide area, no clear axis of advance, no obvious focal point. It looked, to some, like a diversion. It looked, to others, like the beginning of everything. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel was not there to read those signals. He had left France the day before, travelling to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to press his case for additional armour directly with Hitler. It was a decision that would haunt every account of this night. In his absence, his chief of staff held the fort at Army Group B's headquarters, but the authority to act, the authority to move the Panzer Reserve, did not rest with Army Group B at all. The strategic mobile reserve in France, the armoured formations that Rommel had argued so bitterly to position closer to the beaches, fell under a command arrangement of extraordinary rigidity. OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, had designated certain panzer divisions as its personal reserve, and those divisions could not be released without the explicit authorization of the Supreme Commander himself. That night, the Supreme Commander was asleep at the Berghof. The standing orders were unambiguous and, in retrospect, staggering in their consequence. No officer in France, regardless of rank or circumstance, could issue a movement order to the OKW-held Panzer Reserve without Hitler's personal approval. By the time the naval bombardment began, the vast orchestration of hundreds of warships opening fire on the coastal defences in the pre-dawn hours, commanders in Normandy were already placing increasingly desperate calls to OKW, requesting release of the armoured formations that might still, if moved quickly enough, push the landing forces back before a bridgehead consolidated. Those calls were received by aides and staff officers who, acutely aware of Hitler's displeasure when woken without cause, judged that the picture remained too unclear to disturb him. The result was a headquarters frozen, not by Allied action, but by its own institutional habits of deference. At Panzer Group West, the commander responsible for the armoured reserve in the West, the mood shifted from uncertainty to alarm as the naval bombardment's scale became apparent. Reports arriving through the early morning hours described not a harassing operation or a feint, but a landing of enormous weight. The volume of naval gunfire alone, audible, according to some accounts, dozens of kilometers inland, suggested a commitment of resources that no diversion could justify. The requests to OKW grew more urgent. Calls were placed. Intermediaries were consulted. The response was consistent. The Führer had not yet authorized movement. The panzer divisions sat in their assembly areas, engines cold, crews standing near their vehicles as the sound of the bombardment rolled across the Norman countryside like distant thunder that would not stop. Waffen-SS formations were caught directly in this paralysis. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, positioned south of Caen in its training and assembly areas, was among the formations whose commanders understood, with mounting clarity, that something historic was unfolding to the north. Officers who had served on the Eastern Front, who had felt the texture of large-scale operations, recognized the scale of what the sound and signals traffic implied. But the order to move did not come. Standing orders required them to wait. Fuel loads were checked and rechecked. Radio operators monitored the frequencies, and through the hours of early morning, as Allied troops came ashore on 5 beaches, and the initial chaos of the landings began resolving itself into the slow, grinding work of breaking through the coastal defenses, the panzers remained stationary. The telephone exchanges within the German command structure that morning have been described by surviving officers as a kind of organized desperation. Every rung of the hierarchy understood that time was the critical commodity, that each hour the Allied forces spent ashore without facing armored counterattack was an hour they used to move ammunition forward, reinforce their positions, and push inland. Rundstedt's headquarters at OB West made formal requests to OKW that were relayed, sat upon, and filtered by layers of staff who remained unwilling to breach the personal authorization protocol. The system that had been designed to concentrate decision-making at the top became, on this particular morning, a mechanism for preventing any decision at all. Hitler woke sometime in the mid-morning hours. The briefings he received were presented, by some accounts, with a degree of theatrical optimism by staff officers who had themselves accepted the prevailing OKW interpretation that the Normandy landings might still prove to be a feint, that the main blow, the real invasion, might yet come at the Pas de Calais, exactly where German intelligence assessments had long predicted it. This belief, carefully nurtured by Allied deception operations over many months, did not dissolve in a single morning. Hitler, reviewing the reports, appears to have retained his conviction that the Normandy landing was a preliminary move. The full Panzer Reserve was not immediately released. Partial authorization trickled through. The window in which a concentrated armored response might have met the Allies at or near the shoreline was already closing. When release orders finally reached the Waffen-SS formations in the early afternoon, the conditions they would face had already changed fundamentally. The sun was fully up. Allied aircraft, the fighter bombers and medium bombers that German ground commanders would come to regard as the defining tactical feature of this campaign, had established a presence over the roads and rail lines leading north toward the coast. Moving armor in daylight under those conditions meant moving it through a gauntlet of strafing runs and bomb attacks that could not be predicted, avoided, or suppressed with the anti-aircraft resources available to the ground formations. The 12th SS Panzer Division, receiving its orders to move, was preparing to advance into a tactical environment that bore no resemblance to the open-air transit it might have conducted in the darkness of the early morning, had the authorization come in time. The contrast with what had been possible was almost unbearable in its specificity. A movement begun at 2 in the morning, or 3, or 4, before the beaches were consolidated, before the breakout from the sand began, before naval gunfire and air cover had been fully organized into coordinated support, would have inserted heavy armor directly into the path of forces that were still fighting at the waterline. Instead, the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions received their march orders when the battle was already several hours old, when the geography of the landing had already shifted from the beach to the fields and lanes behind it, when Allied troops were digging in and armor was beginning to roll off landing craft. The moment, to use the language of military staffs, had passed. Not because anyone had defeated the German armored reserve, because no one in the German command structure had been willing to authorize it to move. This was the operational wound beneath the tactical battle that would follow for weeks. Throughout June and July, as British, Canadian, and American forces expanded their bridgehead, and the Waffen-SS panzer divisions threw themselves against that expansion in attritional engagements of tremendous ferocity, the irreversibility of the 6th of June's morning would hang over every German defensive calculation. The Allied forces had been given time, not much time, not comfortable time, but enough to transform a vulnerable amphibious force caught between the sea and the German defenses into a lodgment that could be reinforced, supplied, and expanded. That gift had not been purchased with any particular tactical genius on the Allied side. It had been handed over by a command system that elevated Hitler's personal authority above every other consideration, including the most basic requirements of military responsiveness. The Waffen-SS soldiers themselves, the crews and company commanders and NCOs who had trained through the spring and waited through the night, bore none of the responsibility for what had been lost. They had followed their orders. They had stood beside their vehicles in the darkness and listened to the distant bombardment and waited for instructions that came too late. When the orders finally arrived, they moved. They accepted the air attacks on the roads. They pushed north through the congestion of other units and the craters left by Allied bombs and the general disorder of a command structure that was only beginning to understand the scale of what it faced. They drove toward Caen and toward the Canadians and British who were pushing inland, toward the meeting engagement that would define weeks of brutal fighting. What greeted them when they arrived was not the chaos of an assault force still fighting for its footing, but the hardening resolve of armies that had gained ground and meant to hold it. The 6th of June had not delivered the decisive armored counterattack that might, in another version of that morning, have changed the character of the campaign. Instead, it had delivered paralysis, deference, and delay. And by the time the Waffen-SS panzers were finally moving north through the Norman lanes, the Allied armies were already building the world they would have to fight through. There are formations in every war that carry something beyond their equipment and their orders, something in the way they were made. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was one of those formations. It had been built from a specific idea about what a soldier should be, and that idea was frightening in its completeness. The young men who filled its rifle companies and tank crews had not simply been conscripted and trained. They had been shaped, year by year, since early childhood, by an entire apparatus of state ideology that treated soldierly sacrifice not as a duty reluctantly borne, but as the highest possible expression of a life well lived. By the spring of 1944, the division sat in assembly areas south of Caen, a coiled formation of roughly 20,000 men, the overwhelming majority of whom had never seen a calendar year beginning with 1925. They were, in the plainest terms, children trained to the standard of veterans. That standard was enforced by the men above them. The division's officers and non-commissioned officers were not drawn from the same generation as its riflemen. They were, in large measure, survivors of the Eastern Front, men who had fought at Kharkov and Leningrad, and in the frozen reaches of the Soviet interior, men who understood the physical grammar of close combat in ways that no training manual could fully transmit. They brought that knowledge downward through the ranks, with a ferocity that the teenage soldiers absorbed without obvious complaint, because the culture they had been raised inside offered no framework for complaint. What emerged from this combination? Young bodies, fanatical conditioning, and experienced leadership was a formation that Allied intelligence assessed with genuine unease. The British and Canadians, who would eventually meet this division in the hedgerows north of Caen, would discover that unease was entirely warranted. Command of the Hitlerjugend rested, in those opening days of June, with Fritz Witt, a veteran SS officer who had served in some of the most punishing battles on the Eastern Front, and who wore his authority with a quiet, almost understated efficiency that was unusual in an institution that often prized theatrical certainty. Witt understood his division's strengths, and he understood its limitations. It had been trained hard, and it believed in itself with a depth that bordered on the absolute. What it had not yet been tested against was the full weight of Allied combined arms, the interplay of naval guns, ground attack aircraft, artillery, and armored infantry that the Canadians pushing south from Juno Beach would bring to bear. On the morning of the 6th of June 1944, that test was coming to meet the division, whether the division was ready or not. The march orders reached the Hitlerjugend's forward headquarters in the mid-morning hours of the 6th of June. There had already been hours of confusion, hours in which reports of Allied airborne landings had filtered through German communication channels without resolving into a coherent operational picture. Now the picture was clearer, or at least clear enough. A massive amphibious landing had gone in along the Calvados coast, and one of its primary axes of advance pointed directly south, toward Caen, the city that General Montgomery had identified as a critical objective, and that the German High Command understood must be held at almost any cost. The Hitlerjugend was ordered to move north. It would counterattack the Allied bridgehead and drive the invaders back to the sea. The orders were issued with the kind of confidence that headquarters tend to project, a confidence that the men who would have to carry those orders along contested roads had no particular reason to share. Moving an armored division in daylight in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 was not the same as moving one by night across a quiet sector of France. The division had been told that Allied air superiority was a factor. What that phrase meant in practice became apparent almost immediately. The road network north of the division's assembly areas ran through open country, through small market towns, through stretches of farmland where a column of tanks and half-tracks was visible from considerable altitude against the June light. Allied fighter bombers had been ranging over these roads since before dawn, and they did not stop. The Typhoons and Thunderbolts worked in pairs and in flights, hunting anything that moved and attacking with rockets and cannon that could disable a tank and were nearly certain to destroy a soft-skinned vehicle. The Hitlerjugend's march north became, almost from its opening hours, a study in interrupted movement. Columns halted at the sound of aircraft engines. Drivers pulled vehicles under tree cover when it existed and prayed for cloud cover when it did not. Officers moved on foot between halted vehicles, trying to maintain some thread of command over units that were dispersing instinctively across the landscape. The division's fuel and ammunition vehicles, which had to follow the fighting units north, were particularly vulnerable, and losses among these supply columns were significant enough to complicate the division's combat power before it had fired a single shot at an Allied soldier. The road surfaces themselves became obstacles, vehicles disabled by air attack, or by the simple mechanical consequences of pushing heavy armor at speed over routes not always designed to bear it, blocked the narrow Norman lanes, and forced detours that cost time no one had to spare. The order to counterattack by last light on the 6th of June dissolved quietly into the reality of what movement actually looked like on that particular afternoon. There was something else slowing the march that had nothing to do with aircraft or road conditions. The division was encountering the landscape of Normandy for the first time as a tactical problem, and the landscape was not cooperating. The Bocage country that began north of Caen and stretched toward the coast was a world of sunken lanes, Thick, earthen banks, topped by ancient hedgerow, small enclosed fields that broke every long line of sight and turned each 100 meters of advance into a separate tactical calculation. This was not the open steppe of the Eastern Front, where armor could roam, and where the distances involved made air observation and coordination relatively manageable. This was close, secretive country that favored defenders and punished attackers who did not read it correctly. The Hitlerjugend's veterans understood close terrain, but they had not fought in this particular kind of close terrain, and the adjustment would cost something. Through the afternoon and into the early evening, lead elements of the division continued pushing north, while the bulk of the formation sorted itself from the disorder of the approach march. The teenage grenadiers who had been sitting in their lorries during the air attacks, tense, alert, possibly frightened in ways they had no sanctioned language to acknowledge, began to deploy into the fields and lanes north of Caen as the light began to change. Their training told them what to do in contact. Their officers and sergeants, men who had survived situations considerably more dangerous than this, kept the forward units oriented and moving. The division was not intact, not at its full strength, not operating with the clean efficiency that its training exercises had suggested. But it was present, it was armed, and it was closing on the Canadians. Those Canadians had had a day of their own. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had come ashore at Juno Beach in the morning hours, amid surf conditions that were rougher than the planners had hoped, taking significant casualties in the opening minutes against the beach obstacles and the fortified positions covering the waterline. But the Canadians had driven through. By early afternoon they had pushed several kilometers inland, clearing villages and establishing a line that represented the deepest Allied penetration of the day on any sector. Some Canadian units had approached to within a very short distance of the outskirts of Caen, before consolidating as the afternoon wore on. They had fought hard, and they had advanced farther than almost anyone else on the 6th of June. Now, as darkness settled over Normandy, they were digging in and reorganizing, not yet knowing with precision what was moving toward them from the south. What was moving toward them was unlike anything the Canadian formations had yet faced in this war. The soldiers of the Hitlerjugend had been told, in the particular language of the institution that had created them, that they were the answer to the invasion, that their duty was absolute, and that retreat was not a concept their division recognized. This was not merely rhetoric for external consumption. For many of these young men, it was genuinely believed. The combination of ideological certainty, physical toughness, and experienced small unit leadership produced a formation that, whatever moral judgments history would eventually levy against it, was going to be very hard to move. The Canadians, who were themselves a formidable fighting force, were about to discover this. The collision that both sides were now drifting toward across the dark Norman fields would define the battle for Caen for weeks to come. By the time the 6th of June passed into the 7th, the 12th SS Panzer Division had not achieved what its orders described. It had not driven the Canadians back to Juno Beach. It had not retaken any significant ground. It had arrived in the operational area in a state of partial disorganization, having absorbed punishment from the air and the mechanical punishment of a forced march over unsuitable roads. But it had arrived. Its forward units were in contact with Canadian reconnaissance elements north of Caen. Its tank crews were in their vehicles. Its grenadiers were in the hedgerows. And its commanders, whatever frustration they carried about the day's delays, were already planning the fighting that tomorrow would bring. The failed counterattack of the 6th of June was not the end of the Hitlerjugend's battle. It was, in a very real sense, only the approach march to it. Everything that would follow, the brutal village-by-village fighting, the atrocities, the grinding strategic stalemate around Caen, had its roots in this churned-up, air-harassed, confused movement through the Norman countryside, toward an enemy who was digging in and would not give ground easily, and who would exact a price for every field the Hitlerjugend tried to take. Caen was supposed to fall on the first day. That was the plan as written, the ambition as briefed, the marker on the map that Allied commanders had circled with such confidence in the weeks before the landings. Canadian and British forces would push inland from the beaches, move fast through the Norman countryside, and take the city before German reserves could respond. It was a reasonable hope on the 5th of June, 1944. By the morning of the 7th, it was already clear that hope had collided with something harder than anyone had fully anticipated. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had arrived, and with it, the grinding, costly, close-quarters battle that would define the Allied experience at Caen for the next 2 months. The terrain itself conspired against the attackers. Normandy's bocage country, the dense network of ancient hedgerows, sunken lanes, and thick earthen banks that divided every farmer's field from his neighbours, had not featured prominently in Allied planning. It would become one of the defining conditions of the campaign. These were not the low decorative hedges of an English garden. They were walls of roots and compacted earth, often taller than a standing man, laced with thorns and undergrowth, built up over centuries, each one a natural firing position, and each sunken lane a potential kill zone. Tanks could not see over them. Infantry could not move around them without exposing themselves to fire. Progress had to be earned, field by field, village by village, at a cost that could not be easily absorbed by forces already stretched from the beaches. The 12th SS Panzer Division moved into these conditions, having been bloodied by Allied air attacks during its approach march, but still carrying its fighting power largely intact. Its veteran officers and NCOs, many of them Eastern Front survivors, understood immediately how to use the terrain. They placed their anti-tank guns in the hedgerows, where they could cover the approaches to villages. They dug their infantry into the banks themselves, invisible until the moment they opened fire. They turned each small cluster of Norman stone buildings, Orthy, Buron, Carpiquet, the villages stretching north and west of Caen, into small fortresses to be taken at rifle range, with grenades and bayonets. Against this defensive posture, the Canadians of the 3rd Infantry Division pressed forward with courage and mounting losses. The first major clash came as Canadian columns advanced south from Juno Beach, along the roads leading toward Caen, moving through villages that felt deceptively peaceful in the June morning light. The fighting that erupted in and around Orthy on the 7th of June gave a brutal early indication of what lay ahead. Canadian infantry found themselves caught in the open as the Hitlerjugend's panzer grenadiers and tanks struck from concealed positions, and the engagement dissolved into the kind of close-range chaos that no amount of training fully prepares a soldier for. Men died in doorways, in orchards, in the narrow lanes between farm buildings. Positions changed hands more than once before the day was out. The Canadians gave ground in places and held in others, and by nightfall, the line of the battlefield had shifted in ways that made neither side's communiques particularly honest. There was something else happening in and around these engagements that would mark the Normandy campaign long after the last shot was fired. In the days immediately following D-Day, Canadian prisoners taken by elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division were killed. These were not isolated incidents attributable to the fog of individual actions. They occurred in multiple locations, across different units of the division, over several days. Wounded men were executed. Prisoners who had surrendered were shot. The scale and pattern of what happened constituted documented war crimes, and they have been examined and re-examined by historians and courts in the decades since. The culture of the division, its youth, its ideological conditioning, the contempt bred into it for those it classified as enemies, created the conditions in which these acts became possible, even normalized among some of its members. The victims were real men, with names and families, and their fate would eventually form part of the legal reckoning with SS command responsibility. The village of Buron changed hands multiple times across several days of fighting, its stone walls chipped and broken by shell fire, its streets contested by men who could sometimes hear each other breathing through the rubble. The Canadians attacked, gained ground, were pushed back, and attacked again. The Hitlerjugend held with a ferocity that astonished even experienced observers. Its teenage soldiers, many of them barely old enough to shave, shaped since childhood by an ideology that promised them glory and taught them to despise weakness, fought with a single-mindedness that the Canadians found difficult to break. Their individual bravery, to the extent it can be separated from its ideological framework, was not in question. What it produced on the ground was a defensive line that refused to collapse even when logic suggested it should. Carpiquet Airfield became one of the most symbolically contested pieces of ground in the northern approach to Cornwall. Lying just west of the city, its open runways and concrete structures sat at the edge of the bocage terrain, a rare open feature in a landscape defined by concealment. The Hitlerjugend recognized its value immediately and defended it with a commitment that would keep the airfield out of Allied hands for weeks. Canadian assaults that reached the perimeter would be driven back. The airfield's defenders used the open ground as a killing field, channeling attackers into lanes of fire that were impossible to neutralize, without artillery that could not always be accurately directed in time. Carpiquet would become shorthand for the frustration of the entire Northern Cons battle. Objectives that seemed reachable, held by defenders who simply would not give way. On the Allied side, the failure to take Caen in the first days of the campaign was becoming a source of anxiety at the highest levels of command. Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces, maintained publicly that events were proceeding according to plan, that the purpose of the Caen sector was always to draw German armor away from the American breakout sector further west. There was truth in that framing, but there was also the reality that Caen sat unbroken, and that 3 armored divisions' worth of Allied fighting power was being absorbed in attritional combat north of the city against a single SS Panzer division and its supporting elements. The gap between the plan's language and the map's reality was widening with each passing day, and the men doing the fighting felt it in ways that briefing documents did not capture. For the Hitlerjugend, the first week of fighting had also imposed costs that the division's strength tables could not sustain indefinitely. It had arrived in Normandy as one of the most powerfully equipped armored formations in the German order of battle. Its complement of Panzer IV and Panther tanks gave it a striking power that had delayed the Allied advance significantly, and its Panzer Grenadiers had traded their lives for ground meters at a time. But every tank lost to a Canadian anti-tank gun, every company commander killed in a village street, every supply convoy caught on an exposed road by Allied fighter bombers represented a deduction from an account that Germany had no way to refill. The Eastern Front had taught the division's veterans how to fight outnumbered. It had not given them a solution to being outproduced. The bocage also ground down Allied armor in ways that planners had not fully modeled. British and Canadian tank crews, many of them engaging in their first sustained combat, found that the hedgerows negated much of the superiority that numbers should have provided. A tank pushing through a hedgerow exposed its belly, the thinnest part of its armor, to any anti-tank weapon positioned on the other side. Moving along the sunken lanes meant moving in single file, unable to maneuver or support each other effectively. The Germans, fighting defensively and using the terrain they had had weeks to study, held a structural advantage that partially compensated for the disparity in overall strength. Allied tank losses in the first week north of Caen were severe, and the lessons being learned about hedgerow warfare were being written in the wreckage of vehicles that had seemed invincible a month earlier on the assembly grounds of England. What the first 10 days of fighting north of Caen revealed, above everything else, was that neither side possessed the ability to force a clean, decisive outcome in the terrain and conditions that Normandy presented. The Hitler Jugend could hold. It could counterattack with ferocity. It could bleed Allied formations to a standstill. What it could not do was drive those formations back into the sea, which was ultimately what Hitler demanded and what the German strategic situation required. The Canadians and their British allies could press, could absorb punishment, could grind forward village by village with infantry and armor and artillery. What they could not do, not yet, was break through a defensive line manned by soldiers who seemed to have no psychological mechanism for retreat. The result was a battle of accumulation, of losses, of exhausted units, of villages reduced to rubble, that favored neither side in the short term, but was slowly, day by day, tilting toward the power that could replace what it lost. Caen stood, its citizens, caught between opposing forces in a city that both sides needed, but neither side was yet willing to negotiate away, endured bombardment and occupation, and fear in roughly equal measure. The Norman countryside north of the city had been transformed in the space of a week, from farmland to a battlefield so dense with obstacles and contested ground that every advance required a full operational effort to produce modest territorial gain. The 12th SS Panzer Division had done what it was sent to do, stopped the Allied advance short of its D-Day objectives, and bought time for the broader German defensive position to consolidate. The price of that success counted in the lives of its own soldiers, the lives of the Canadians pressing against it, and the lives of prisoners who never made it back from captivity, was being tallied in ways that would not be fully reckoned with until long after the guns had fallen silent. In the opening days of June 1944, as Canadian and British forces pushed inland from the beaches north of Caen, the German command structure faced a critical shortage. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend was moving to meet the threat, its teenage soldiers and hardened veterans converging on the landing zones, but it was already clear to German planners that this single division would not be enough to contain the beachhead. The Allies were pouring ashore in numbers that defied easy calculation. They controlled the skies above Normandy absolutely, and they were bringing ashore not just soldiers, but tanks, artillery, vehicles, and supplies in a steady stream that showed no sign of slowing. General Montgomery's plan demanded the rapid capture of Caen, the largest city in the Normandy sector, and while the 12th SS held up the Canadian advance with desperate fighting in the villages to the north, the Germans knew that additional armoured strength would be needed if they were to prevent a breakthrough that would tear their defensive line to pieces. That reinforcement was the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, named after Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, from which it had grown in the years before the war. The Leibstandarte represented the elite of the Waffen-SS, a formation that had fought across the entire Eastern Front and accumulated both a fearsome battlefield reputation and documented cases of atrocity. By June 1944, the division numbered roughly 20,000 men and was equipped with a mixture of Panther tanks, Mark IV Shermans, and supporting armored vehicles and infantry carriers that made it one of the most powerful formations in the German order of battle. On the 4th of June, 2 days before the invasion lanterns lit along the Normandy coast, The Leibstandarte was positioned in its assembly area near Bruges in Belgium, resting, refitting, and maintaining strict security about its ultimate destination. The division's commander was Sepp Dietrich, a former NCO and committed Nazi who had built the Leibstandarte into a force feared for its aggression in attack and its ruthlessness in victory. Dietrich was not a professional soldier in the Prussian tradition. He was a political soldier, a man whose loyalty to Hitler and to the ideological vision of the Nazi state was total and unquestioning. But he was also a competent operational commander who understood the mechanics of large-scale armored warfare, and he knew that if his division was to reach Normandy and have any impact on the battle, it would have to move through a killing zone of Allied air attacks that would make the journey itself a test of operational skill and sheer nerve. The orders to move came on the evening of the 6th of June, as Hitler's initial paralysis was giving way to the first fragmentary counter-orders that would attempt to contain the invasion. The Leibstandarte was told to prepare for movement into Normandy, to assemble its columns, and begin the long push westward toward the combat zone. The distance was not vast. Bruges to the Normandy sector was roughly 250 kilometers. But in 1944, under the conditions of absolute Allied air superiority, that journey might have been 2,000 kilometers. The moment the division began to move, it was exposed. No German fighter aircraft could protect the long columns of armored vehicles, supply trucks, and infantry carriers that would inch westward along the roads of Belgium and France. The division had to move by day and by night, had to find routes that avoided the major arterial roads where Allied Jabos, fighter bombers, hunted in packs, and had to accept losses that accumulated with every kilometer of road traversed. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant air force in Europe, was now a spent force in Normandy. German pilots were outnumbered, their aircraft were worn out, and the best of them had been killed in years of grinding attrition on the Eastern Front and in the defense of the Reich itself. The skies above the French countryside belonged to the Allies, and belonged to them utterly. The Leibstandarte began its movement on the 7th of June, and immediately the air attacks began. Columns of vehicles, some carrying troops, others ammunition and fuel, still others spare parts and medical supplies, stretched for kilometers along the narrow roads that twisted through the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy and adjacent territories. Allied pilot briefings had made clear that any military vehicle moving toward the invasion zone was a target. Typhoons and Mustangs and Spitfires swept down on the columns, their cannon fire and machine gun rounds ripping through the thin armor of trucks and the soft skin of personnel carriers. Smoke rose from burning vehicles. Men scattered into the roadside vegetation, seeking whatever cover they could find. The division moved at night when possible, using only the faintest blackout lights to navigate the roads. But even this could not eliminate the danger. Artillery spotters worked in conjunction with fighter bombers, marking targets that could be hit by aircraft at first light. German anti-aircraft crews mounted on half-tracks and towed into position tried to protect the columns, but they could not be everywhere at once, and the sheer number of Allied aircraft meant that sooner or later, even the best protected columns would take losses. The Leibstandarte lost vehicles and men to air attack on nearly every day of its movement toward Normandy. Small losses in the context of a division's total strength, but losses nonetheless that had to be absorbed and accounted for in the ledgers of war. The movement was further complicated by the congestion of the roads themselves. The Leibstandarte was not the only German unit attempting to reach Normandy in these crucial first days. Other SS units, Wehrmacht panzer divisions, motorized infantry formations, and the endless stream of supply vehicles that kept the armies supplied with fuel, ammunition, and rations, all competed for limited road space. Roads were blocked by bomb craters, Bridges had been destroyed or damaged by Allied air attacks in the weeks before the invasion, necessitating detours that added hours or even days to journeys. Traffic control became a nightmare for the German staff officers trying to coordinate movement. Radio communications were intermittent and unreliable, partly from Allied jamming and partly from the sheer difficulty of maintaining secure communications in an active combat zone. The division had to halt and wait for clearances to move, then advance only to be stopped again by congestion or air attack warnings. Each delay meant that the division arrived later in the Normandy sector, and in the fluid opening stages of the campaign, time was everything. The Allies were moving faster than anyone in the German command structure had expected. The beachhead was expanding by the hour. Villages were falling. Caen itself was being outflanked. The Leibstandarte was racing against a closing window, aware that every hour of delay was an hour in which the Allies consolidated their grip on Normandy. By the 10th of June, 4 days after receiving its movement orders, the Leibstandarte had covered sufficient distance to be within striking range of the front lines. The division had lost vehicles and men to air attack, had been held up by congestion and detours, had moved in fits and starts through a landscape that was increasingly torn by the machinery of war, but the formation was still largely intact. The division's Panzer Regiment, equipped with the Panther tanks that were the finest medium tanks Germany could put into the field, had suffered only minor losses. The infantry elements, mounted in half-tracks and personnel carriers, were intact and ready for combat. Sepp Dietrich had kept the division together, had managed the movement under conditions that would have fragmented a less cohesive formation, and now the Leibstandarte began to enter the battle area northeast of Caen. The division was assigned to support the 12th SS, which was already in contact with Canadian forces in and around the villages of Carpiquet and Rotz and Nori. The arrival of the Leibstandarte meant that the German commander in the sector, General Friedrich Dollmann, now had 2 full SS Panzer divisions with which to defend against the British and Canadian advance. The balance of forces was shifting. The Allies no longer faced just the 12th SS, a formidable opponent, but a single division. They now faced the Leibstandarte as well, a fresh, nearly full-strength armoured division, with nearly 2,000 fighting men per regiment, and enough tanks to conduct serious tactical manoeuvres. The commitment of the Leibstandarte changed the character of the battle around Caen. Up to this point, the fighting had been intense, but largely disjointed, with German counterattacks mounted by the 12th SS pressing against the Canadians, but never quite achieving the mass and coordination necessary to drive them back into the sea. Now the Germans could mount counterattacks with 2 divisions. The Leibstandarte moved into line on the left flank of the 12th SS, and within hours of taking its position, it began to make contact with British forces who were pushing southward and trying to link up with the Canadians. The fighting that followed was brutal and attritional. British tank squadrons clashed with German panzer companies in small engagements that swirled around the Norman villages, each side trying to gain the advantage of ground and surprise. German anti-tank guns, dug into hedgerows and concealed in farmyards, waited for British tanks and took a steady toll of armour. British artillery, concentrated in unprecedented densities and registered on German positions, pounded the defenders and made German movement during daylight hours nearly suicidal. The Leibstandarte learned what the 12th SS had already learned in the previous week, that Normandy in 1944 was not the Eastern Front. There, German panzer divisions could maneuver, could find open ground for tank-on-tank engagements, could use speed and surprise to achieve decisive results. In Normandy, the bocage, the thick hedgerow barriers that divided every field and concealed anti-tank guns, turned every advance into a nightmare of clearing operations. of infantry fighting through the hedgerows under intense fire, of tanks pushing blind into situations where a single anti-tank gun could stop them cold. The arrival of the Leibstandarte signified something else as well, the beginning of a grinding attritional battle that would last weeks rather than days. The German command had hoped to contain the beachhead within days, to strangle it with counterattacks, and prevent the Allies from consolidating their position. That moment had passed. The Allies now had enough troops ashore, enough material, enough logistical support, that they could not be pushed back into the sea. The battle around Caen would become a test of endurance, a battle of attrition, in which both sides would feed in reinforcements, would maneuver for local advantages, would try to break through the other's lines through a combination of firepower and weight of numbers. For the Germans, this was a nightmare scenario. They could not replace losses as fast as the Allies could. Their air force could not challenge the Allies in the air. Their logistics could not sustain a prolonged war of material consumption. But they had no choice. Hitler had forbidden any retreat, had declared Normandy the decisive sector, and so the Germans would fight. The Leibstandarte, fresh and eager, would throw itself into the battle. Sepp Dietrich would commit the division piecemeal, in local counterattacks, trying to stop the British and Canadian advance, and in doing so, would feed the division into the same grinding attritional machine that was slowly grinding down the 12th SS. The appearance of the Leibstandarte in the British and Canadian sector marked the transition from the first phase of the Normandy campaign, the desperate gamble of the opening days, into the second phase, the grinding stalemate that would persist until late July. Montgomery's strategy depended on fixing the German panzer divisions in place around Caen, pinning them down with continuous pressure from the British and Canadian forces so that the American forces on the left could build up strength and launch a breakthrough in their sector. For Montgomery's strategy to work, the Germans had to remain committed to Normandy, had to feed divisions in to stem the British and Canadian threat, and had to remain tied down in the Bocage fighting when they should have been withdrawing to prepared positions further south. The Leibstandarte's arrival ensured that the Germans would do exactly that. Sepp Dietrich could not have ignored the British and Canadian threat if he had wanted to. The presence of two SS panzer divisions facing Montgomery guaranteed that the Germans would be locked in place, would be pulled into the attritional battle that Montgomery was counting on, and would be unable to disengage and reorganize. The arrival of the Leibstandarte meant that the Allies would have to fight harder to break through, but it also meant that when the breakthrough came, and the German lines finally collapsed, it would come with such catastrophic losses to the German forces that recovery would be impossible. As the Leibstandarte settled into its positions north of Caen in the second week of June, the shape of the battle to come was already becoming clear. The division would fight a series of battles that would be remembered not for dramatic breakthroughs or decisive maneuvers, but for grinding, bloody progress, measured in hundreds of meters and in the slow accumulation of losses that could not be replaced. The Bocage had a particular brutality all its own. Every hedgerow concealed machine gun positions. Every stone farmhouse became a fortress. Every village had to be taken house by house, room by room. German soldiers trained in the open field warfare of the Eastern Front had to adapt to close quarters fighting, where visibility was limited to tens of meters, and where precision artillery and machine gun fire could cut down whole sections if they tried to advance without complete coordination. British soldiers and Canadian soldiers learned the same lessons at the same time, paid the same terrible prices for mistakes and miscalculation. The Leibstandarte would spend the next 2 months in this kind of fighting, would lose men and tanks and vehicles, would rotate units in and out of the line to rest and refit, and would discover that the myth of the invincible SS Panzer Division was precisely that, a myth that crumbled under the weight of British and Canadian firepower, Allied air superiority, and the simple fact that Normandy in 1944 was the worst possible terrain in which to fight a war with tanks and mechanized forces. The movement of the Leibstandarte from Belgium to Normandy and its commitment to the fighting around Caen represented a crucial moment in the campaign. The division had arrived nearly intact, despite losses to air attack and the chaos of movement under wartime conditions. It brought with it some of the finest soldiers Germany could field, men who had fought on the Eastern Front and had accumulated years of combat experience. But the arrival of the Leibstandarte also meant that the Germans were now fully committed to the battle for Normandy. The reserve had been committed. The attempt to contain the invasion with the initial defensive forces and the first wave commet. By the 26th of June 1944, Montgomery's British Second Army had spent 3 weeks grinding against the German defences around Caen without breaking through. The city itself remained in German hands, stubbornly held by Wehrmacht and SS units, who had transformed its suburbs and approaches into a maze of strongpoints and prepared positions. The bocage, the dense Norman hedgerow country that divided the landscape into 1,000 small compartments, had proven itself a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare, neutralizing much of the advantage that British numerical superiority and armor might otherwise have conveyed. Progress had been measured in miles, often in yards, and the casualty lists were climbing, with no decisive breakthrough in sight. Montgomery, under mounting pressure from London and Washington to deliver a decisive result, began to conceive a new operation that would bypass the stubborn defences around Caen and strike deeper into German-held territory. The plan was called Operation Epsom, and it represented a gamble. Punch armour across the Odon River, seize the high ground to the south and west, and threaten to encircle Caen from the rear, forcing the Germans to either abandon the city or face destruction. The operation was set to begin on the 26th of June, with a preliminary bombardment, and the main thrust would come from the Second Army's 30th Corps, under General Bernard Montgomery's direct supervision, supported by the 8th Corps and the 1st Corps, holding the line to the north. The attacking force would consist of 3 infantry divisions, breaking through the existing positions, followed by 2 armoured divisions, the 11th Armoured and the Guards Armoured Division, pouring through the gap and driving south to cross the Odon. The corridor they would drive through ran roughly east to west, a stretch of country already partially occupied by British forces, but heavily contested at its forward edge. Artillery would be massed in unprecedented concentrations to blast open the German positions and disrupt German communications as the assault began. The operation had been meticulously planned, with every division assigned its objectives, and every brigade and battalion given its precise role in the unfolding battle. Intelligence reports suggested that the Germans had limited reserves immediately available south of Caen, and if the breakthrough could be achieved quickly enough, before German counterattacks could be mounted and assembled, the entire tactical picture might shift decisively in Britain's favour. The first hours of Epsom went broadly according to plan. Infantry divisions pushed forward under covering fire from more than 800 guns, a barrage that the Norman landscape had rarely, if ever, experienced in such concentration and intensity. German positions crumbled under the weight of the bombardment, and advancing companies found themselves moving through terrain transformed by high explosive into a nightmare of craters and shattered hedgerows. Prisoners came back, and resistance, while fierce and localized, gave way before the momentum of attack. The critical objective was the Odon River crossing, but between the British lines and the Odon, lay several miles of contested countryside that first had to be secured. The infantry regiments committed to the assault moved with increasing confidence as the morning wore on, and by the afternoon of the 26th, forward elements of the 11th Armored Division began to push through behind them, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough the infantry could achieve. For a brief electric moment, it appeared that the careful planning might actually work, that something approaching a genuine rupture in the German front might be opening. But the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS commanders in Normandy understood what was happening, and they responded with the speed and flexibility that had kept them in the fight, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of General Willy Bittrich, a capable officer with Eastern Front experience and a reputation for aggressive counterattacking, received the alert about the British assault and immediately began shifting forces northward. The 9th SS Panzer Division and the 10th SS Panzer Division were moved toward the threatened sector, and the 5th Panzer Army's Panzer Divisions were alerted to prepare for commitment against the developing breakthrough. Word came down through the chain of command that this British attack could not be allowed to succeed, that any breakthrough south of Caen would jeopardize the entire German position in Normandy. The German defensive doctrine that had been refined across years of fighting in Russia was already being executed. Break up the British attack with anti-tank guns and concentrated small arms fire, then hit it in the flank and rear with panzer formations to restore the line. The British were about to encounter the German defensive system at full capacity, and the SS panzer formations were moving into the fight. By the evening of the 26th, the Odon River lay just ahead of the British columns, and the advanced guard of the 11th Armored Division reached its crossing points in the gathering darkness. The river itself was no great obstacle. It was wide enough to require bridging, but not so wide that it could not be crossed by determined engineers and assault troops. However, the eastern bank and the high ground beyond it were now thick with German resistance, and the darkness that fell that night did nothing to improve the British situation. German artillery began to fall with increasing accuracy, and reports of panzer movements south and east of the Odon added urgency to the growing realization that the attack, for all its initial success, had not yet achieved a clear breakthrough. The next day, the 27th of June, would see the real test, as the British pushed tanks across the Odon and onto the high ground beyond, trying to consolidate the foothold before German counterattacks could be properly organized and launched. The crossing of the Odon on the 27th of June represented one of the largest and most bitterly contested river crossings of the Normandy campaign. Sappers, working under fire, threw bridges across the river as German artillery and machine gun fire raked the crossing sites. Tanks and anti-tank guns poured across as fast as the engineers could get them over, and by late morning, the British had established a formidable bridgehead on the southern bank. But the German response was already crystallizing. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had fully grasped the threat, and Willy Bittrich committed the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions to a series of coordinated counterattacks that would continue throughout the day and deep into the night. SS Panzer Grenadiers dismounted from their half-tracks to assault British defensive positions, while tanks and anti-tank guns provided covering fire. The high ground just south of the Odon became a cauldron of fire and movement, with attacks and counterattacks flowing across the same few hundred yards of countryside over and over again. Neither side gave ground willingly, and casualty figures on both sides began to mount with sickening speed. The Germans possessed several tactical advantages in this grinding engagement. Their knowledge of the terrain was superior. Their artillery observation posts were positioned to dominate the bridgehead, and their panzer formations, though not unlimited in strength, were enough to prevent any British advance beyond the immediate vicinity of the Odon crossing. The British, conversely, were trying to push through a narrow corridor and expand it against enemy pressure from multiple directions, a task that demanded constant reinforcement and supply across the river crossings that were themselves under bombardment. The Guards' Armoured Division was committed to help break the deadlock, and for 3 days, the 2 armoured divisions slugged it out with the SS Panzer divisions in some of the heaviest tank fighting Normandy would see. Villages changed hands multiple times. Gavras, Tourmauville, and others, whose names have since faded from common memory, but whose streets ran with blood and burned with tank fire. British Churchills and Cromwells, American Shermans, squared off against Panzer IVs and Panthers of the SS, with victory decided by who could bring the most guns to bear on the hottest part of the line and who would hold nerve when the enemy counterattacked. The intensity and sophistication of the German defense caught many observers off guard. Here was not a force in collapse or disarray, but rather a coordinated and dangerous opponent who understood how to use armor and anti-tank guns in concert to punish an advancing enemy. The SS Panzer divisions, contrary to some popular narratives, did not break through and overwhelm the British, nor did they manage to drive them back across the Odon. What happened instead was a bitter, grinding stalemate, in which both sides fed reinforcements into a meat grinder with no end in sight. The SS formations took severe casualties from massed British artillery fire, from air attacks when the weather permitted Allied aircraft to fly, and from point-blank firefights against British armor. The British, in turn, were exhausted by constant fighting and worn down by the German determination to hold every yard of terrain. The promised exploitation south from the Odon, the grand maneuver that would unravel the entire German position, never materialized. Instead, Montgomery found himself locked into yet another attritional battle, this one just as grinding as the fighting around Caen itself. By the 29th of June, it had become clear that Operation Epsom would not produce a breakthrough of the magnitude that had been originally conceived. The objective of reaching toward Villedieu and threatening Caen's southern flank was abandoned as a practical impossibility in the face of German resistance. Instead, the operation settled into a holding operation, with Montgomery's forces consolidating the bridgehead across the Odon and digging in against expected German counterattacks. The SS Panzer divisions, having blunted the British thrust, now faced orders to mount their own series of counteroffensives aimed at pushing the British back across the Odon entirely and restoring the line. These counterattacks, launched over the first week of July, were desperate affairs, coordinated with Wehrmacht panzer divisions, but ultimately unable to gather sufficient strength to break the British bridgehead. The SS formations were taking casualties that they could not replace, burning through fuel and ammunition at rates that the German logistics system was struggling to match, and losing experienced soldiers and small unit leaders who could never be fully replaced. The broader picture that emerged from Epsom was one of mutual exhaustion. Both the British and the Germans had committed serious forces to the battle, and both had paid a serious price. The British had advanced some 5 miles to the south and established a secure bridgehead across the Odon, securing high ground that would prove valuable for subsequent operations against Caen. The SS Panzer divisions had prevented a breakthrough and maintained the integrity of the German position, but they had done so at a cost that left them severely weakened and unable to conduct sustained offensive operations. The myth of SS invincibility had not been shattered. The German defense in the Odon sector was a model of tactical competence and defensive power, but neither had the SS proved capable of winning a decisive victory when facing a well-coordinated and substantially numerically superior enemy. Epsom had demonstrated that even elite formations with superior training and doctrine could be ground down by weight of numbers, superior artillery, and unrelenting pressure. The loss figures from the Epsom fighting were sobering for both sides, though official counts varied, and casualties were often listed differently, depending on whether one was counting killed, wounded, missing, or prisoners. The British had lost hundreds of tanks in the operation, with mechanical breakdowns and repairs drawing as many vehicles out of action as enemy fire. The SS Panzer divisions had lost tanks, half-tracks, and personnel in quantities that their already thin resources could poorly spare. Officers and experienced non-commissioned officers fell, and young soldiers who had been trained in the disciplined and sophisticated German style found themselves replaced by hastily trained replacements who lacked the depth of preparation the original conscripts had received. The SS formations emerging from the Odon sector were still fighting formations, still capable of defense and local counterattack, but they were no longer the force that had arrived in Normandy. They had been blooded in major battle, had faced a Western enemy at strength, and had discovered that even superior training and organization were not sufficient to overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Montgomery would continue to hammer at the German defenses around Caen throughout early July, setting the stage for Operation Charnwood, the combined air and ground assault that would finally break the deadlock. But Epsom had established something crucial: the Waffen-SS, for all its reputation and all its demonstrated competence, was locked into a form of warfare, attritional, artillery-dominated, conducted against an enemy with superior numbers and resources that favored the Allies. Each German counterattack, each defensive battle, each attempt to regain initiative, burned through reserves of men and equipment that simply could not be replaced. The SS Panzer Corps in Normandy was being systematically worn down, transaction by transaction, and there was no strategic reserve waiting in Germany that could reinvigorate them. The campaign would continue for another month, with more names added to casualty lists and more villages contested in the bocage. But the fundamental verdict of Epsom had already been rendered. The German forces in Normandy, including their most formidable units, were in a race against time, and time was running out. On the morning of the 14th of June 1944, Fritz Witt stood in his headquarters near the village of Venois, roughly 8 kilometers northwest of Caen, and surveyed the operational map before him. The commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was a lean man in his early 40s, with the bearing of a professional soldier and the background of a true veteran. He had fought across the Eastern Front, had learned warfare under conditions of savage intensity, and had come to France with the confidence that comes from having survived the worst that the Soviet army could inflict. His division was young. Many of its men were teenagers, barely old enough to shave, conscripted or volunteered into the Hitler Youth formations that the Nazi regime had transformed into frontline combat troops. But Witt understood how to lead such men. He knew how to mold inexperience into unit cohesion, how to weld raw courage to tactical discipline, and how to extract maximum fighting power from soldiers who were terrified but tried not to show it. The battles around Caen had begun to test those skills in ways he had not fully anticipated, and the reports flowing into his headquarters painted a picture of a situation that was deteriorating by the hour. The fighting in the first week after the landings had been fiercer and more confused than Witt had expected. The 12th SS had clashed repeatedly with Canadian infantry pushing inland from Juno Beach, and while the division had succeeded in preventing the Canadians from reaching their first-day objectives, the cost had been steep. Casualties mounted daily. The hedgerow country of the Norman bocage had fragmented the orderly flow of command and control, that any division headquarters depended upon. Radio communications had been disrupted by Allied electronic warfare, and the simple friction of moving armor and infantry through thick vegetation, where signal officers could barely string their cables fast enough to keep up with forward companies. Witt had established his command post in the vicinity of Venois because it offered reasonable access to the division's scattered components and positioned him where he could attempt to coordinate both offensive thrusts and defensive consolidations. But the location was a liability in ways that became increasingly apparent as the campaign progressed. The German High Command had anticipated that once the invasion came, naval gunfire would be a factor, but the sheer scale and accuracy of Allied naval bombardment had exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates made during the winter planning sessions in Berlin. The Royal Navy and the American Navy maintained constant observation over the beachhead and the immediate hinterland. Any concentration of German troops, any headquarters that seemed to be a center of decision-making, any gathering of vehicles or command vehicles drew the attention of naval gunners who had observer teams ashore and spotters in aircraft who could call down shells from distances of 20, 30, or even more kilometers away. A German general or colonel moving across open ground in daylight, attempting to visit a forward position or coordinate between units, risked being targeted by artillery fire that arrived with almost supernatural speed and accuracy. The old rules of warfare, in which a headquarters could be identified by the collection of staff vehicles and signal trucks surrounding it, had become a death trap. Fritz Witt understood this intellectually. Every German commander at Normandy understood it. The solution, in theory, was to move constantly, to maintain multiple command posts, to operate with the absolute minimum of visible staff infrastructure, and to relay orders through runners and brief radio bursts, rather than relying on the elaborate signal nets that had served German armies for decades. In practice, it was nearly impossible. A division headquarters existed to coordinate the actions of dozens of scattered unit commanders, each of whom needed to understand what the division was trying to accomplish, where the main effort was being directed, and what reserves were available if a crisis developed. That coordination required a physical location where communication equipment was concentrated, where maps could be updated in real time, where the division commander could gather his subordinates for brief orders and hear their reports. Witt had tried to minimize the risk by keeping his headquarters small, by moving it frequently, and by using a vehicle that looked like any other command car rather than something that might attract attention. But he was not willing to abandon the ability to command his division in real time, and that refusal, understandable and necessary as it was, left him vulnerable. On the morning of the 14th of June, the tactical situation around Caen was approaching a critical phase. The British and Canadians were preparing for renewed assaults, and Witt was attempting to position his division to meet them. Reserves needed to be committed. Counterattacks needed to be coordinated. A division commander could not sit in a distant, perfectly safe location and conduct such operations by relay and guess. He had to be where he could see, understand, and react. Witt had established a forward command post in a location that seemed defensible and relatively concealed, a position from which he could monitor the fighting around the division's area of operations. He was there when the shells began to arrive. They came from the sea, called in by Allied observers who had spotted the cluster of vehicles and the movement of officers that marked a German divisional headquarters. The bombardment was intense and accurate, the kind of massed naval gunfire that had become the signature of Allied operations at Normandy. The explosion that killed Fritz Witt struck his command vehicle at 15 hours in the morning. The shell impact was massive, final, and instantaneous. There was no wound to treat, no moment of suffering, no opportunity for last words or reflection. One moment he was a divisional commander, thinking through tactical problems and trying to hold his division together under conditions of increasing stress. The next moment he was gone, along with several members of his staff who had been nearby. The news of his death spread through the division's officer corps like a shockwave. Witt had been respected, even admired by many of his subordinates. He represented continuity and professional competence in a formation that was suffering losses at every level. His death was not just a personal tragedy or even a command succession issue. It was an event that rippled through the entire division, at a moment when the division could afford to lose no one. Command of the 12th SS Panzer Division passed to Kurt Meyer, a man who would become one of the most controversial figures of the Normandy campaign. Meyer was younger than Witt, more aggressive, and far less experienced in divisional command. He had served with distinction as a junior officer and had a reputation as a fierce combat leader, the kind of officer who led from the front and was willing to take risks that more cautious commanders would reject. In the context of the fighting around Caen, where desperate situations seemed to arise daily, and where the tactical initiative was slipping from German hands, Meyer's aggressive style initially seemed appropriate. He threw himself into the work of keeping the division functioning, of coordinating with other SS and Wehrmacht units, and of attempting to mount local counterattacks that might slow the Allied advance. But Meyer was also an officer shaped entirely by the ideology of the Waffen-SS. He had no independent command experience beyond battalion level, and he was now trying to control a division that had been shattered by a week of continuous fighting, and was facing enemies who possessed almost unlimited material resources. The death of Witt highlighted a fundamental shift in the conditions of warfare that the invasion of Normandy had produced. In the opening campaign in Poland, in the brilliant operational successes against France in 1940, and even in the early phases of the Eastern Front, German commanders had enjoyed a certain freedom of movement and action that allowed them to exercise personal command and to respond to tactical crises by moving to the point of crisis themselves. The introduction of overwhelming Allied air superiority and naval gunfire had changed that calculus entirely. A German general who tried to command in the old style, moving freely across the battlefield to assess situations and coordinate subordinates, was committing suicide. The lesson that Witt's death delivered was that command at Normandy had to be exercised differently, more remotely, with less personal contact between commander and the forward elements of the division. This change in the nature of command had profound consequences. German divisions found themselves forced to establish multiple backup command posts and to maintain communication through methods that were often unreliable. Orders had to be issued in anticipation of situations that might develop, rather than in response to situations that were actually occurring. Subordinates had to exercise more independent judgment, because by the time a report reached the divisional commander and a response came back down the chain of command, the tactical situation had usually changed. The result was a gradual erosion of the tight coordination and rapid decision-making that had characterized German operations in earlier campaigns. Officers at every level found themselves working in a fog of uncertainty, attempting to execute orders that had been issued hours or even days earlier and that no longer matched the situation on the ground. The impact on the fighting around Caen was significant. In the days and weeks following Witt's death, the 12th SS Panzer Division continued to fight with ferocity and tactical skill, but the division became progressively less able to mount the kind of coordinated, division-wide operations that had been attempted in the first week after the landings. Instead, the fighting devolved into a series of battalion and company-level engagements, with divisional headquarters attempting to coordinate them through communications that were frequently broken or unreliable. When Meyer tried to mount larger operations, they often failed because the component units could not coordinate effectively. or because the timing of the attack did not match the arrival of supporting elements, or because reserves designated for exploitation were delayed or diverted by the necessity of dealing with threats elsewhere. The loss of effective command and control was gradual and almost invisible in the moment, but it was no less consequential than the loss of tanks or soldiers. Other German commanders at Normandy learned the same lesson from Witt's death and from the continuous harassment of German headquarters throughout the campaign. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte moved its command post multiple times in a single day to avoid detection. The commander of the Second Army, General Paul Hauser, was himself wounded by naval gunfire on the 21st of June, a reminder that even the highest-ranking German officers were not safe from the reach of Allied naval artillery. Headquarters moved constantly, usually at night, usually under conditions of extreme stress and poor visibility. The signal officers who maintained communications networks found themselves constantly setting up new equipment in new locations, often without adequate shelter or security. Messages were duplicated and distributed through several different channels because no single communication system could be trusted to remain functional for more than a few hours. The whole apparatus of command, which relied on stability and concentration, had to operate under conditions of constant disruption and movement. The death of Fritz Witt was mourned by the officers who had served with him, but it was perhaps more significant as a symbol of the larger shift that was taking place in the nature of warfare at Normandy. The age of the Wehrmacht, in which highly trained officers exercised personal command over large formations, and in which the focus of the battle could be controlled by the movements of a single general, was ending. In its place came a new kind of warfare, one in which command was exercised through systems that were increasingly fragmented, in which decisions had to be made with incomplete information, and in which the coordination of large units became progressively more difficult as the technical capability of the Allies to disrupt communications and target headquarters grew. The Waffen-SS would continue to fight hard at Normandy, would continue to inflict casualties on the Allies, and would continue to prevent the rapid breakthrough that Montgomery's forces had hoped to achieve in the opening days of the campaign. But they would do so under conditions that no German commander, no matter how experienced or skillful, could fully control. The burden of command had shifted, and the means by which commanders could bear that burden had been fundamentally altered by the reality of Allied firepower and control of the battlefield. The city of Caen had become the prize that neither side could ignore. For more than 3 weeks after the landings, British and Canadian forces had pushed south from the beaches, only to find their advance grinding to a halt against an ever-hardening German defense, anchored by the SS Panzer divisions. By early July, the Norman capital had become a symbol of Allied frustration, an objective that should have fallen on the first day of the invasion, yet still remained beyond reach. The cost of the stalemate was mounting hour by hour. Young soldiers were dying in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country that fragmented battalions into isolated pockets and turned every advance into a sequence of small, brutal encounters. Something had to break, and Montgomery's staff had concluded that the break would come only with overwhelming force and a willingness to destroy the city itself, if necessary to secure it. Operation Charnwood was the answer to that calculation, a massive coordinated assault combining strategic bombing, artillery saturation, and ground attack, designed to finally smash through the German lines and bring the British and Canadian armies into Caen. The plan for Charnwood was ambitious in its scope and shocking in its method. Rather than attempting another costly frontal assault through the rubble and ruins that already scarred the northern approaches to Caen, the Allies would employ air power on a scale rarely seen in support of ground operations. On the evening of the 6th of July, more than 450 heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force and the United States 8th Air Force would converge on the German defensive positions north of the city in a carpet bombing campaign intended to neutralize the anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine gun positions that had proven so deadly to advancing British and Canadian infantry. The bombing would begin in darkness to minimize German fighter interference and would continue through the night, laying down tons of high explosive across a zone roughly 2 miles deep. This would be followed by a massive artillery bombardment, with hundreds of guns pouring shells into the German positions for hours before the ground assault began. The infantry and armor would then advance through the wreckage and disarray to finally breach the German line and pour into the city. It was a plan that reflected Allied strength and German weakness, the ability to simply overwhelm a position through the application of material superiority that no defense could ultimately resist. But the bombing was not precise, and precision was not the intention. The heavy bombers dumped their loads in a general area rather than targeting specific defensive positions, and the dark meant that pilots were relying on radar and dead reckoning to find their targets. Inevitably, many bombs fell on Caen itself rather than on the German positions beyond it. Civilians who had endured the bombardments of late May and June found themselves engulfed in a new wave of destruction. Entire streets were obliterated, fires spread across the ancient Norman city, and hundreds of men, women, and children died in the rubble. The distinction between a bombing campaign against military targets and the destruction of a city became academic when thousands of tons of high explosive were falling indiscriminately on residential neighborhoods. The moral weight of this decision, to destroy a city in order to liberate it, would weigh on planners and participants for the rest of their lives. Yet, at the moment of execution, it seemed the only way forward, when soldiers were dying and the strategic situation demanded that the Germans be driven back. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte held the main defensive line north of Caen, supported by Wehrmacht formations, and dug into a network of prepared positions that had grown more sophisticated with each passing day. The young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend had fought with fierce determination for nearly a month, their morale sustained by SS indoctrination, the presence of hardened Eastern Front veterans among their NCO ranks, and a fierce pride in their division. But even elite formations could not withstand 450 heavy bombers. The carpet bombing achieved its intended effect with brutal efficiency. It killed thousands of German soldiers, destroyed fortifications, knocked out anti-tank guns, and left the survivors stunned and disorganized, in a landscape transformed into a moonscape of craters and rubble. The concentrated firepower had worked. What could not be accomplished through repeated frontal assaults by infantry and armor could be achieved through overwhelming bombardment followed by immediate exploitation. As dawn broke on the 7th of July, British and Canadian forces began their ground assault. The infantry advanced through a landscape of desolation, picking their way through craters, wreckage, and the scattered remnants of German defensive positions. Resistance was sporadic rather than organized. German units that had survived the bombing now operating in small groups rather than as coherent formations. The speed of the advance surprised even the commanders who had authorized it, and for the first time in weeks, the British and Canadian forces found themselves advancing in yards and hundreds of yards rather than in yards measured in single digits. Tank columns pushed forward to exploit the breakthrough, and by midday, British and Canadian troops had broken through the outer German defensive line and were beginning to enter the suburbs of Caen from the north. The tightly coordinated German defense that had held firm for weeks had been shattered in a single night. The SS units that had fought so stubbornly in the Bocage were now in retreat, falling back toward defensive positions farther south. their losses replaced by the grim mathematics of war, in which no amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome sufficient tonnages of explosives. The fighting for the city itself was bitter nonetheless. Even as the outer defenses collapsed, pockets of German soldiers held buildings and street corners, forcing the British and Canadian infantry to conduct house-to-house clearing operations in the rubble-filled streets. The destruction wrought by both the bombing and the earlier fighting had transformed Caen into a maze of collapsed buildings, broken walls, and narrow streets choked with debris that made movement difficult and fighting dangerous. Small unit tactics took over, where grand operational maneuver could not. Platoons and companies advanced methodically through the wreckage, clearing buildings with grenades and point-blank rifle fire, contending with snipers and machine gunners who operated from the upper stories of partially destroyed buildings. The SS units and Wehrmacht soldiers fought with determination, born from the knowledge that they were being pushed back, that the defensive line they had held at such cost was finally breaking. But determination alone could not overcome the overwhelming force being brought against them. By the evening of the 7th of July, British and Canadian forces controlled the northern half of Caen, and the surviving German defenders were withdrawing toward the Orne River, the waterline that would serve as their next defensive position. The fall of Caen, even though partial, represented a strategic victory for the Allies that shifted the entire calculus of the Normandy campaign. The city had held the key to expanding the beachhead, and its loss meant that German strategic options were narrowing. But German commanders did not waste effort on recriminations or despair. Instead, they focused on preserving their fighting force and establishing a new defensive line south of the Orne River, where the terrain remained as favorable as it had been north of Caen. The German withdrawal was executed with the precision expected of professional soldiers. Rearguard units covering the retreat of the main body, combat engineers destroying bridges and laying additional obstacles to slow Allied pursuit. The SS panzer formations that had been locked in combat for weeks were pulled back to regroup, repair vehicles, and refit. The armor preserved for future operations even as the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. German commanders understood that they could not hold ground indefinitely against an enemy with overwhelming air superiority and unlimited reserves of men and material. What they could do was conduct an elastic defense that inflicted maximum casualties on the Allies, while preserving enough combat power to mount local counterattacks and prevent a decisive breakthrough. This strategy would shape the fighting for weeks to come. The destruction of Caen itself became a symbol of the cost of modern war. The medieval city, home to a university founded in the 15th century, cathedral churches that had stood for centuries, and neighborhoods where civilian life had continued despite the fighting, had been reduced to rubble. Thousands of civilians had been killed in the bombing. Estimates varied wildly, but ranged from the hundreds to more than 2,000, a moral cost that weighed heavily on the minds of those who authorized the operation. The survivors emerged from shelters to find their homes gone, their streets transformed into landscapes of devastation, their city's ancient patrimony reduced to ash. The Allies had liberated Caen from German occupation, but had also destroyed much of what made it Caen. This contradiction at the heart of modern warfare, liberation purchased at the cost of destruction, would become a recurring theme as the campaign progressed into other Norman towns and cities, each one marked by the same terrible mathematics of strategic necessity and human suffering. The German withdrawal across the Orne River was not a rout, but rather a deliberate repositioning of forces. The SS panzer divisions dug in on the south bank of the river, establishing new defensive positions from which they could contest any British attempt to expand their beachhead farther south and inland. The terrain on the southern bank of the Orne was as favorable to defense as that to the north had been. Rolling terrain, woods, fields, intersected by hedgerows, small towns built on high ground that could serve as strong points. The German defensive line would harden here, and the stalemate that had characterized the first weeks of the campaign after D-Day would continue, albeit with the Allies now in possession of the Norman capital, and the Germans pushed back to a narrower defensive perimeter. But the loss of Caen represented more than just territorial change. It meant that German strategic options in Normandy were now limited. The attempt to contain the beachhead had failed, and German commanders understood that they were now engaged in a campaign of delay rather than one in which they could hope to push the Allies back into the sea. The question was no longer whether the Germans could win, but rather how long they could delay the inevitable Allied breakout. The significance of Operation Charnwood extended beyond the tactical achievement of breaking through German lines and seizing Caen. It demonstrated the methods by which the Allies would win the campaign for Normandy, through the application of overwhelming force, through the willingness to accept civilian casualties as a necessary cost of military victory, and through the synergistic combination of air power, artillery, and ground forces that left no defense capable of resistance. The SS Panzer divisions had fought with skill and determination. Their soldiers had displayed courage and tactical competence. Their defensive positions had been well chosen and well prepared. None of this had proven sufficient against the sheer tonnage of explosives that the Allies could bring to bear. This was the essential lesson of Normandy, one that would shape the campaign for its remaining weeks. Elite formations and determined defense could slow an advance, inflict casualties, and contest every mile of ground. But they could not ultimately overcome an enemy, blessed with overwhelming material superiority, command of the air, and the productive capacity to replace losses that the defending side could not sustain. The Waffen-SS at Normandy was discovering what German commanders on the Eastern Front had already learned, that courage and ideology were no substitute for unlimited resources and strategic depth. The aftermath of Operation Charnwood set the stage for the next phase of the campaign. The Allies now possessed Caen and a broader beachhead from which to mount further operations. The German defenders remained formidable, but were being steadily pushed into a narrower perimeter with fewer options for maneuver. The SS Panzer Corps, battered by weeks of continuous combat, remained a threat capable of mounting counterattacks and defending prepared positions. But its strategic mobility was increasingly constrained by Allied air superiority that made daylight movement difficult and losses that could not be replaced. What had been a campaign in which German forces could hope to contain and push back the invasion had become a campaign of attrition, one in which German losses mounted steadily, while Allied strength continued to grow with each passing day. The city's fall marked a turning point, not in the sense that the campaign was suddenly decided, for the fighting would continue for nearly 2 more months, but in the sense that the trajectory of the campaign was now unmistakably set. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS were no longer driving events, but were instead responding to Allied initiatives. Pressed back by waves of attack, they could only hope to slow rather than stop. The fight for Caen had cost both sides dearly, but it had broken the German strategic position in Normandy, and from that broken position, the Germans would never truly recover. The 15th of July, 1944, 7 days after the initial assault on the Normandy beaches, and Montgomery's forces had achieved something far less than what the invasion planners had envisioned. Caen remained only partially in Allied hands. The British Second Army sat just south of the city, stalled against a defensive line that had hardened with each passing day. German armor, much of it Waffen-SS, remained intact and dangerous. The Americans, meanwhile, were locked in brutal fighting in the Bocage country west of St. Law's. grinding forward meter by meter, but hardly at the pace that operational plans demanded. Something had to break the stalemate. Montgomery decided that something would be an armored offensive of unprecedented scope and ambition. 3 British armored divisions, supported by infantry and artillery, would punch south from Caen into what intelligence assessments suggested was open or lightly defended terrain. The objective was to drive deep into the Norman countryside, to turn the German flank, and to restore momentum to a campaign that had slowed to an inch-by-inch crawl. The plan was called Operation Goodwood, and it was about to become the most divisive armored battle of the entire Normandy campaign. The German defensive position south of Caen was a masterwork of field fortification, though few in Montgomery's headquarters fully appreciated what they were about to assault. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS had spent weeks constructing successive defensive belts that incorporated natural features of the terrain, anti-tank gun positions sited to provide mutual support and overlapping fields of fire, and carefully positioned panzer and panzer grenadier reserves placed to mount local counterattacks. The forward positions were held primarily by Wehrmacht panzer grenadiers and Waffen-SS grenadiers. The mechanized infantry who had proven their defensive capability throughout the first weeks of the Normandy campaign. Behind them lay the panzer formations themselves, the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with divisions including the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The depth of this defensive system was not accidental. German commanders, denied the strategic initiative in Normandy, had made operational virtue out of tactical necessity. They could not win by attacking, so they would win by bleeding the Allies white on carefully prepared defensive positions until the political will for invasion simply collapsed. It was a grim calculus, and it very nearly worked. The British assault began in the early morning hours with a massive carpet bombing campaign that was meant to stun the German defenders and create gaps through which armor could pour. More than 2,000 heavy bombers dropped tonnages of high explosive across the German positions, creating a spectacle of destruction and fire that seemed almost biblically ordained in its scale. For many of the soldiers watching, it appeared that nothing could possibly survive what fell from the sky. The smoke and dust rose so high that visibility became almost nothing. The artillery barrage that followed the bombing was equally overwhelming. Hundreds of guns fired in carefully orchestrated sequences, their shells adding to the chaos and devastation. The psychological impact on the forward defenders was severe. Some positions were indeed overrun by the sheer magnitude of the bombardment. But the German defensive system had been built precisely with the knowledge that such bombardments would occur. Many of the crucial positions, particularly the anti-tank gun positions and the Panzer Reserve assembly areas, had been positioned not in the immediate forward zones that would bear the brunt of the bombing, but in depths behind them. The bombs and shells, for all their terrible power, were not precisely targeted enough to destroy the entire defensive network. They broke the front, but they did not destroy it. The British armor rolled forward as the smoke cleared, and for the first few hours, the assault seemed to be succeeding. Columns of tanks, Cromwells and Shermans, Churchills and Panthers captured during earlier fighting, advanced rapidly south into terrain that had been battered and disrupted by the bombing. The pace of advance was exhilarating after weeks of grinding stalemate. Some commanders and war correspondents watching the offensive unfold allowed themselves to believe that this was it, the moment the entire German line would collapse and the breakout would finally begin in earnest. The reality, however, was proving far grimmer. The bombed zone provided cover to the German defenders as much as it did to the attackers. The craters and wreckage made it difficult for the British tanks to maneuver. More critically, The German defensive system extended far beyond the areas that had been bombed. As the armor advanced, it began to enter successive defensive belts, each one manned and prepared, each one equipped with anti-tank guns and panzer formations, positioned to defeat exactly this sort of armored assault. The Waffen-SS units, disciplined, experienced, and fighting now on prepared defensive terrain, began to inflict devastating losses on the attacking British formations. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under command of General Paul Hauser, a regular Wehrmacht officer, but one thoroughly enmeshed in the SS command structure by 1944, controlled the depth of the defensive position. The Corps included some of the finest formations available to the German army, formations that had been blooded on the Eastern Front and tempered in the fires of earlier Normandy fighting. As British tanks pushed deeper into the defensive zone, they encountered successive waves of anti-tank guns and panzer reserves. The Waffen-SS gunners and panzer crews, operating from prepared positions where they could bring overlapping fire to bear on attacking formations, exacted a murderous toll. Tanks were knocked out in columns. The advance, which had begun with such promise and speed, began to slow and fragment. Individual armored regiments and battalion groups, advancing over unfamiliar terrain against an enemy that maintained cohesion and tactical discipline despite the bombardment, found themselves in conditions approaching chaos. Radio communications between armored units began to break down as they pushed deeper into the defensive zone. Officers lost track of where supporting units were. The neat, coordinated advance envisioned in the planning documents began to dissolve into a series of scattered engagements between disconnected units and German defenders who maintained superior understanding of their own terrain. The role of the Waffen-SS in this defensive battle was critical and multi-layered. The panzer divisions provided the mobile counterattack force, their own tanks, positioned to meet British formations either frontally or on the flank, as they advanced into pre-selected killing zones. More devastatingly, the SS Panzer Grenadier regiments, the mechanized infantry who formed the backbone of the divisions, operated the anti-tank guns that were inflicting the catastrophic losses on British armor. These were often 88mm anti-aircraft guns, weapons of terrible power that could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The men operating these guns were among the most experienced in the Waffen-SS. They had trained together for months. They understood how to sight these weapons for maximum effectiveness. They knew how to wait patiently for targets to move into their kill zones before opening fire. The result was that British tank losses mounted with terrifying speed. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Armored regiments that had advanced with optimistic confidence found themselves reduced by half within an hour of contact with the German defences. The coordination between the anti-tank guns and the panzer formations meant that British armour could not exploit breakthrough where it occurred, because concentrated anti-tank fire would shred any exploitation force that tried to press forward. The weather, which had been clear in the early morning, began to deteriorate as the day progressed. Low clouds and mist rolled in, reducing visibility and neutralizing the air support that was supposed to be providing close support to the armored advance. The Royal Air Force fighter bombers that were meant to suppress German anti-tank positions found themselves unable to operate effectively. The German air defense, which was admittedly thin compared to earlier in the war, nevertheless managed to claim some aircraft. More importantly, the weather meant that the Germans could move reserves and reposition forces with far less risk of air attack. The British armoured formations, without air support to suppress German defences, and now pushing against defensive depth that had proven far more substantial than pre-battle intelligence had suggested, found themselves in exactly the kind of grinding attritional fight that they had hoped the bombing would have eliminated. By the afternoon of the first day, the offensive was already showing signs of stalling. Casualty rates among the tank crews were catastrophic. The ground that had been gained, measured in kilometers, was dwarfed by the tank losses required to gain it. Officers began to assess whether continued advance made sense, or whether the offensive had already exhausted its momentum. The fighting continued for 3 more days, with the British Second Army feeding additional reserves into the offensive in hopes of achieving a decisive breakthrough. The Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht units continued to contest every position, every village, every piece of high ground, with the kind of tactical discipline that marked professional soldiers fighting on prepared terrain against an enemy that could not bring its superior resources to bear in an efficient manner. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and other formations of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps rotated forces through the forward positions and mounted local counterattacks designed to restore the defensive line wherever it had been damaged by British assault. The British tanks, meanwhile, continued to suffer losses that seemed almost incomprehensible to commanders watching from rear headquarters. The Shermans, in particular, were terrible against the German anti-tank guns and panzer formations. They were faster and more numerous than German tanks, but they were also thinner-skinned and prone to catching fire when penetrated. Tank crews began to speak of Shermans as death traps, coffins with caterpillar tracks. The psychological impact of commanding men into those vehicles, knowing that they had a poor chance of survival against properly sighted German anti-tank guns, began to weigh on officers and NCOs. Yet the assault continued, more from momentum and optimism about breakthrough than from any evidence that breakthrough was actually achievable. By the 19th of July, Operation Goodwood was effectively concluded. The British had advanced perhaps 20 kilometers, which in the context of normal armored warfare might seem an accomplishment, but the cost had been staggering. Tank losses ran to more than 400 machines in some estimates. Casualty figures, among the infantry that was supposed to consolidate the gains, were equally severe. Against this, the Germans had withdrawn in good order, maintaining tactical cohesion and preserving their panzer formations for further defensive operations. The Waffen-SS units that had anchored the German defense, the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Corps and their component divisions, had been damaged but not destroyed. They had proven that defense in depth against armored assault, executed by disciplined and experienced troops, could exact costs so high that the attacker was forced to break off the engagement. The tactical victory, if any existed, belonged to the Germans. The strategic situation, however, was less clear, and that ambiguity would generate controversy. Montgomery claimed that Operation Goodwood, despite its tactical stalling, had achieved a strategic purpose. The offensive, he argued, had pinned down German reserves on the British front, preventing them from being transferred to the American sector where Operation Cobra was about to launch. Whether this was genuinely Montgomery's intention from the beginning, or a retrospective justification for a failed operation, became a matter of immediate and intense debate within Allied High Command. Eisenhower, commanding supreme, was unimpressed. American operational planners believed that the operation had been poorly executed and that it had promised results far beyond what was likely achievable. The British defense establishment, meanwhile, rallied to Montgomery, arguing that the operation had contributed to the overall campaign by keeping German panzer reserves committed on the British front. The reality was both more complex and more ambiguous than either side's rhetoric suggested. Goodwood had not broken through German lines. It had not achieved the deep exploitation that Montgomery had seemingly promised in the operation's planning, but it had inflicted severe losses on British formations, demonstrating conclusively that armored warfare at Normandy would be a grinding slog against an enemy that had adapted effectively to operating on prepared defensive terrain. The Waffen-SS units that fought at Goodwood emerged from the battle with their reputation for tactical excellence reinforced, even as the strategic trajectory of the Normandy campaign moved inexorably toward German defeat. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and its sister formations had demonstrated that they could defeat larger armored assaults through superior positioning, disciplined defense, and coordinated counterattack. Yet at the same time, the very act of contesting these battles was consuming their reserves, fuel, ammunition, replacement soldiers, and the irreplaceable institutional knowledge of experienced commanders and NCOs. With each passing week of attrition, the margin between tactical victory and strategic disaster narrowed further. Goodwood would be the last major British effort to achieve a decisive armoured breakthrough in the Normandy sector. After the 19th of July, the focus of the campaign shifted to the Americans, to Operation Cobra, and to the possibility that breakthrough might come not from the British Second Army grinding down German defences through sheer persistence, but from American forces achieving a wider envelopment that would unravel the entire Normandy position. The Waffen-SS Panzer formations, having demonstrated their defensive mastery at Goodwood, were about to discover that even the finest tactical execution could not prevent strategic collapse when the enemy possessed overwhelming material superiority and the initiative to apply it where it chose. While the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was racing northward from its assembly areas toward Caen on the morning of the 6th of June, another Waffen-SS formation was still hundreds of kilometers away, moving across the breadth of France on roads that would become a corridor of terror. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had been stationed in southern France since the spring, far from the Norman coast, positioned as a mobile reserve that could be committed wherever the Allies might strike. When the invasion began, there was no ambiguity about where Das Reich was needed. The division received its movement orders almost immediately, and what followed was a grueling journey northward through occupied France that would define the Das Reich's reputation in ways far more sinister than any battlefield valor. The route from Montauban in the south to Normandy was roughly 400 kilometers, a distance that under normal circumstances would take a mechanized division 3 or 4 days to cover. But the roads between the Reich and Normandy in June 1944 were far from normal. The skies above France belonged to Allied aircraft, and every column of trucks, every tank, every moving vehicle became a target for fighter bombers and reconnaissance planes, hunting for exactly the kind of concentrated movement that Das Reich represented. The division that began this journey was formidable on paper. Das Reich had been formed in the early 1940s and had fought extensively on the Eastern Front, where it had developed a hard reputation for aggression and ruthlessness. Its strength in June 1944 stood at roughly 18,000 men, organized in 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments, a Panzer regiment, and supporting elements of engineers, reconnaissance troops, and artillery. The division was commanded by Heinz Lammerding, an officer who had served on the staff of Erich von Manstein and who brought to Das Reich the mentality of the Eastern Front, where partisan warfare, ideological struggle, and the deliberate use of terror against civilian populations had become standard practice. The soldiers of Das Reich were a mixture of long-service Eastern Front veterans and younger men drafted or conscripted to bring the division up to strength. Many of the senior NCOs and junior officers had seen years of brutal combat against Soviet forces and partisan bands, and they carried with them not just military experience, but also the habits of thought and action that the Eastern Front had instilled. As Das Reich began its northward march, it was not simply a military formation on the move. It was a unit that had been shaped by years of ideological warfare, and that brought those assumptions, and that violence with it, into the civilian landscape of France. The journey itself almost immediately became a nightmare for the civilians along the route. French resistance fighters and saboteurs had worked to cut roads, block bridges, and harass German columns in preparation for the invasion. When Das Reich attempted to push northward, it encountered not just Allied air attacks, but also determined opposition from the French resistance, which saw in the division's movement both a military threat and an opportunity to strike at the German occupation. The response of Das Reich was not military counteraction against organized resistance. It was collective punishment directed at civilian populations. In the town of Tulle, on the 9th of June, Das Reich troops hanged 99 French civilians in reprisal for resistance killings of German soldiers. In the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, on the 10th of June, a company of the division's Der Führer Regiment descended on the town, separated the men from women and children, and then systematically murdered 642 civilians, women, children, and elderly people locked in a church and burned alive, men shot in separate locations. The Oradour massacre stands as one of the most notorious war crimes of the entire Normandy campaign, an atrocity carried out in cold blood against a community that had no active role in the resistance and that offered no military threat whatsoever. These were not the actions of soldiers in combat panic or desperate defensive struggle. These were acts of premeditated mass murder, the expression of the ideological violence that had defined SS warfare in the East, now transplanted into Western Europe. The journey northward took Das Reich 10 days, instead of the 3 or 4 that normal movement would have required. Every day brought air attacks, ambushes, and detours around sabotaged roads. The division lost considerable equipment to Allied fighter bombers and suffered casualties that slowed its progress. By the time Das Reich began arriving in the Normandy sector around the 16th of June, the division's strength had been worn down by the journey itself, and it had left behind a trail of murdered French civilians that would ensure that in France, Das Reich's name would be remembered not as a powerful military force, but as the instrument of massacre and terror. Yet it was precisely because Das Reich was a powerful military force that it was committed to the fighting around Saint-Lô, and once the division entered combat against the American First Army, it became a different kind of problem to the Allies. Not a criminal organization operating in the rear areas, but a trained and cohesive armored unit fighting in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy that was beginning to define the American experience of the invasion. The American sector in late June 1944 was characterized by fundamentally different terrain and tactical conditions than the rolling country around Caen, where British and Canadian forces were fighting SS panzer divisions in more open ground. The bocage of southern Normandy was an ancient landscape of high hedgerows, sunken roads, small enclosed fields, and dense vegetation that had been built up over centuries. Every hedgerow represented a potential defensive position, and every field was a potential ambush site. The terrain favored the defense, and it favored small unit tactics over the kind of armored breakthrough warfare that panzer formations had perfected in the Soviet steppes. When Das Reich entered this landscape in the middle of June, it found itself in an environment where its advantages in training, leadership, and armor were markedly reduced. The American First Army, under General Omar Bradley, was fighting a different kind of war than the British and Canadians were fighting in the north. The American advance was methodical, bloody, and attritional. The Germans held Saint-Lô, a key crossroads town in the center of the American sector, and from the high ground around the town, they could dominate the bocage and make every American advance costly. Das Reich was committed to defending this ground and to preventing the Americans from breaking out of the Bocage country and into more open terrain where armor could maneuver. The fighting around Saint-Lô and the surrounding Bocage country in late June and early July was some of the most grueling infantry combat of the Normandy campaign. Das Reich, despite its losses during the journey northward, was still a formidable formation, but it found itself engaged against American infantry divisions that were learning how to fight in the Bocage and that were beginning to understand how to counter German armor in close terrain. The American advance was measured in hundreds of meters a day, and the cost in casualties was staggering for both sides. Das Reich defended each hedgerow, each sunken road, each small village, with determination and tactical skill. German grenadiers and panzer crews fighting in the enclosed spaces of the Bocage were able to inflict serious losses on American infantry divisions that were struggling to adapt to terrain that their training had not prepared them for. The division's panzer tanks, when committed in these tight spaces, were less effective than they would have been in more open ground, but they still provided firepower and shock value that helped anchor the German defense. Days would pass with American forces advancing only enough to be counted in hundreds of meters, and each day brought casualties to both sides. The commanders of Das Reich, despite the atrocities the division had committed during its journey northward, were competent professional soldiers who understood their tactical situation. They knew that the American advance had to be slowed, that every day the division could hold the Bocage was a day that bought time for the German High Command to stabilize the front and mount counterattacks elsewhere. They also knew, increasingly clearly as June turned into July, that the overall strategic position was becoming impossible. The Allies had landed with overwhelming force. They controlled the seas and the skies, and they were grinding forward despite the fierce resistance of German units, including Das Reich. But in the narrow context of holding the Bocage, Das Reich performed adequately. The division tied down multiple American divisions, inflicted serious casualties, and proved that even after the journey northward, it remained a coherent fighting force, capable of contesting every square kilometer of ground. Yet the same men who fought with tactical competence in the Bocage were also the men who had murdered more than 600 French civilians at Oradour-sur-Glane just days before. And this contradiction, military effectiveness alongside systematic brutality, would come to define how Das Reich would be remembered and how it would be studied in the years after the war. As Operation Cobra began in late July and the American breakout started to accelerate, Das Reich's role began to shift from a defensive operation in the Bocage to increasingly desperate attempts to plug gaps in the German line and to mount counterattacks against the expanding American penetration. The division was moved to different sectors repeatedly as the American advance picked up momentum, and its strength continued to decline through losses in combat, through attrition, and through the constant pressure of American artillery and air power. By the time the division became involved in Operation Lüttich, the German counterattack at Mortain, in early August, Das Reich had been worn down by weeks of continuous combat and was being asked to participate in an operation that most experienced German commanders knew was strategically doomed. Yet the division executed its orders, drove forward toward Mortain, and participated in what would become one of the catastrophic German decisions of the Normandy campaign, a commitment of panzer formations to an attack that made them even more vulnerable to encirclement and destruction by the Americans driving around the German flank. The Das Reich that emerged from the Normandy fighting in August 1944 was a shattered formation. The division had suffered staggering losses in men and equipment, had been pushed steadily backward by the American advance, and had been cornered in the Falaise pocket, along with the rest of the German forces, trapped by the converging American and Canadian armies. The soldiers who had murdered at Oradour-sur-Glane and Toul were the same soldiers who had fought and died in the Bocage, and many of them would die or be captured during the breakout from Falaise. In the longer historical memory, Das Reich would be remembered not primarily for its role in slowing the American advance or for its tactical competence in the Bocage, but for the atrocities it committed. Yet the military reality was that Das Reich, like the other SS Panzer divisions committed to Normandy, had proven to be a capable fighting force that inflicted serious losses on the Allies and that demonstrated the formidable tactical qualities of German armored formations, even when they were being asked to fight in terrain that did not favor armor, and even when they were being gradually worn down by superior Allied resources and firepower. The division's journey from southern France to Normandy had marked it as an instrument of terror and murder. Its fighting in the Bocage and around Saint-Lô, and later around Mortain, demonstrated that it was also a unit capable of skilled and determined military action. These two aspects of Das Reich, the criminal and the military, coexisted throughout the Normandy campaign, and both must be understood to fully grasp what Das Reich was and what its role in Normandy meant. The American experience of fighting Das Reich in the Bocage was fundamentally different from the British and Canadian experience of fighting the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte around Caen. The Americans were fighting in closer terrain against a division that was slightly less fresh than the German units facing the British in the north, and in a campaign that was defined by grinding infantry-heavy warfare rather than the more open armored battles that characterized the fighting around Caen. American commanders learned to respect Das Reich as a fighting force, to understand its strengths, and to adapt tactics to counter them. Yet American soldiers also learned, as soon as they moved beyond the Bocage and into the rear areas, about the massacres at Oradour-sur-Glane and Toul, about the fact that the division they were fighting had systematically murdered French civilians along its route northward. This knowledge added another layer to the American determination to break through the German line, to trap the German forces in the Falaise pocket, and to ensure that Das Reich and the other SS formations would not be able to organize another defense or launch another counterattack. The reputation Das Reich had earned through massacre, combined with its reputation as a capable military force, made the division a symbol of what the Allies were fighting against. Not just military power, but also the moral catastrophe that National Socialism represented. By the end of the Normandy campaign, Das Reich had been reduced from a fully strength panzer division to a fraction of its original strength. Scattered across the Seine, pursued relentlessly by American forces, and marked forever by the atrocities its men had committed while on the road to Normandy. By late July, the Normandy stalemate had become unbearable. For nearly 2 months, American forces in the Bocage had fought through fields and hedgerows at crushing cost, measuring their daily progress in yards rather than miles. The landscape itself had become an enemy. Sunken lanes and dense farmland gave every German squad the advantage of concealment and prepared defense, while American infantrymen paid in blood for every village, every field, every ridge. But in the upper echelons of command, a plan was forming that would shatter this grinding equilibrium. Operation Cobra, scheduled for the 25th of July, 1944, would attempt what frontal assault could not achieve: a decisive breakthrough of the German line south of Saint-Lô that would enable armored formations to pour through the rupture and swing toward the rear. It would rely on the most violent means at Allied disposal. The operation opened with a weight of destruction that dwarfed anything the Normandy campaign had yet witnessed. In the early hours of the 25th of July, American B-17 bombers and medium bombers began streaming toward German positions south of Saint-Lô, releasing tonnage after tonnage of ordnance onto the narrow sector facing the American First Army. The bombing continued in waves, from first light through the mid-morning hours, laying an aerial carpet across the German defensive zone so dense that survivors described it as if the earth itself was being torn apart. Approximately 1,000 aircraft participated in the bombardment. The weight of bombs exceeded 5,000 tons. Along a front roughly 10 kilometers wide and several kilometers in depth, the German line was subjected to an intensity of fire that rendered individual units powerless. Observation posts were obliterated. Command posts were buried. Entire battalions vanished into craters. The psychological effect on German troops, already exhausted from weeks of attritional combat, was profound. Among the German formations caught in this apocalypse was the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, positioned in the southern sector of the American front. Das Reich had endured weeks of grinding combat against American First Army forces, losing strength in bitter fighting through the hedgerows. The division now held positions south of the bombing zone, but its forward elements and supporting units were within or adjacent to the area being pummeled. Yet the bombing also claimed American casualties. 1,032 American soldiers were killed or wounded by their own air force during the bombardment, a tragic reminder that such concentrated firepower was inherently imprecise. Among the dead was General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American general to be killed in the European theater, struck down by friendly fire as he observed the bombing. The tragedy underscored the ferocity and chaos of what had been unleashed. In the aftermath of the bombardment, the American ground assault began. Mechanized infantry and armor of the First Army surged forward to exploit the devastation. The German forward positions had been largely annihilated. Units defending the line were shattered, their cohesion destroyed, their commanders killed or incapacitated. For the first time in the Normandy campaign, American forces began to move with the tempo of pursuit rather than the grinding rhythm of siege. Villages that had held for days fell in hours. The Bocage, which had channeled and limited American maneuver for weeks, began to yield to columns of tanks and half-tracks, pushing southward and, critically, beginning to wheel eastward toward the German rear. The breakthrough was not instantaneous. German units rallied, reformed defensive lines, and mounted local counterattacks. Yet the scale of the catastrophe was evident to German commanders from the first day. The line had been not merely bent, but broken. The implications for the SS Panzer Corps were immediate and dire. As word reached German higher command that a major American breakthrough was in progress, orders began flowing to SS and Wehrmacht formations to move toward the rupture and seal it before an American exploitation could widen into operational encirclement. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, which had been pulled back to refit after the exhausting fighting around Caen, received urgent orders to move south and strike the advancing American armor. The 9th SS Panzer Division, already engaged against American forces, was directed to wheel northeastward to constrict the salient and prevent further erosion of the German position. The 10th SS Panzer Division was ordered to move toward the breakthrough zone from its position in the south. These formations began moving within hours, but they moved into an environment utterly transformed by Allied air superiority. Roads were interdicted by fighter bombers, columns were strafed, supply trucks were destroyed. Movement was possible only under cover of darkness or heavy cloud, and progress was measured in slow, painful kilometers rather than the swift marches that Panzer doctrine demanded. The SS formations that could reach the breakthrough zone attempted to execute local counterattacks designed to cut off the American spearheads, destroy the bridgehead they were establishing, and restore the German line. These counterattacks began within 2 days of the breakthrough and continued through the closing days of July. The Leibstandarte, moving into position against the advanced elements of the American breakout force, struck at American armor and mechanized infantry in a series of violent engagements in the farmland between Saint-Lô and the breakthrough sector. The fighting was sharp and extremely costly for both sides. German panzer crews, veterans of the Eastern Front, still possessed formidable combat skills. They inflicted losses on American armor, yet they were operating in an environment where American air superiority meant that any concentration of German force would draw Allied fighter bombers within minutes. German armor that held its ground to fight risked destruction by American Thunderbolt aircraft. German armor that attempted to maneuver was vulnerable to interdiction. The question for SS commanders was which death to choose. By the last days of July, it had become clear to experienced German commanders that the American breakthrough could not be stopped by local counterattacks. The forces attempting to contain it were insufficient in strength and constantly weakened by air attack and attrition. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces, was driving exploitation faster than German formations could respond. Armor columns probed southward and eastward, seeking to widen the breach and ultimately to swing around the German flank in a maneuver that would encircle much larger German forces to the north. SS panzer divisions that had expected to fight a contained battle in the Normandy sector were being overtaken by events moving faster than tactical response could match. The strategic calculus had shifted. What had appeared for weeks to be a German defensive success, holding ground against Allied assault at terrible cost, was being unraveled by a breakthrough that transformed static defense into a race against encirclement. The SS formations, elite though they were, found themselves unable to influence the pace or direction of the battle. They were being swept into a cauldron. By the end of the 4th week of July, the breadth of the American breakthrough had become undeniable. What began as a tactical rupture in a narrow sector had widened into an operational break in the entire German position. American armor was moving not only south but eastward, toward the rear areas, and lines of communication that sustained German forces, holding the static front further north. The First Army was breaking free from the bocage warfare that had constrained it, and armored formations that had been held in check by the restrictive terrain were now unleashed into more open country, where their mobility and firepower could be fully employed. The SS divisions attempting to contain this breakout were being reduced by attrition, repeatedly mauled by air attack, and fundamentally unable to restore a cohesive defensive line because the resources and depth did not exist to do so. A defensive scheme that had been stretched thin, even in static combat, could not be reconstructed while under relentless pressure. German commanders recognized that the campaign in Normandy, already a war of attrition being lost by Germany, had now entered a phase where not merely tactical failure, but strategic collapse was becoming possible. The response of the Waffen-SS to Operation Cobra was, in purely military terms, correct. Formations were committed where they could inflict maximum damage. Counterattacks were mounted to attempt to buy time for a strategic redeployment. Defensive positions were held longer than might have seemed rational, to delay enemy momentum. Yet all of this was insufficient, because the fundamental condition of warfare had shifted. For 6 weeks prior to Operation Cobra, the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht had possessed enough strength in a confined space, with prepared positions and depth, to contain American assault. The SS Panzer Corps, drawn from multiple divisions, had repeatedly held against British and Canadian armour around Caen. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, despite its losses, had maintained the ability to fight and counterattack in the bocage. But Operation Cobra was not an assault on a prepared line with limited objectives. It was an attempt to shatter the entire structure of German defence and to exploit the rupture with mobile formations operating in 3 dimensions, including from the air. No German formation, regardless of training or fighting capacity, could maintain cohesion under such conditions. The question was not whether SS units could resist, but how rapidly they would be destroyed or driven into operational collapse. The implications for the Falaise Pocket, which would close around German forces within 3 weeks, were already latent in the failure to contain Operation Cobra. By the end of July, the German High Command was aware that its forces in Normandy might be facing encirclement. Yet operational decisions were being made not by the field commanders, who understood the danger, but by Hitler in his headquarters, reading situation maps and issuing orders based on incomplete information and strategic fantasy. Operation Cobra would prove to be the rupture from which the German position in Normandy could never recover. The attritional stalemate of June and early July would give way to a rapid campaign of pursuit and encirclement in which the Waffen-SS, despite moments of fierce resistance, would be overtaken by events and circumstances beyond its capacity to influence. The elite formations that had held ground against overwhelming odds would soon find themselves racing toward the same gap through which their comrades were fleeing. The breakthrough, on the 25th of July, marked the moment when the Normandy campaign ceased to be a question of whether Germany could hold, and became instead a question of how many German troops could be saved from destruction. For the SS Panzer Corps, that moment was the beginning of the end. By early August, the American breakout from the bocage was no longer a prospect. It had become reality. General Omar Bradley's forces had cracked the German line near Saint-Lô, and armoured columns were pouring through the breach like water through a broken dam. The speed of the American advance had surprised even the planners who had designed it. Where German commanders expected to see a slow, methodical push southward and eastward, they were instead watching mobile columns race forward across open terrain, bypassing strongpoints, and driving deeper into what had been the German rear area. The breakthrough was unfolding faster than any defensive response could be organized, and for the first time since D-Day, the possibility of complete tactical collapse hung over the German position in Normandy. Yet it was at precisely this moment of maximum German weakness and maximum American momentum that Adolf Hitler decided to launch a major counterattack. Rather than permit a fighting withdrawal or attempt to stabilize the line with the forces that remained, Hitler ordered an operation that would drive westward through the American spearhead, cross to the sea near Avranches, and seal off the American breakout entirely. The operation would be called Lüttich, named after the Belgian fortress that had held out in 1914. The geography was simple enough in conception. The Americans had committed heavily to their drive southward and eastward. Their northern flank, along a line stretching from Mortagne through Mayenne, was thin and vulnerable to exploitation. If German panzer divisions could punch through that thin crust, wheel west to the coast, and establish a new defensive position, they would sever the spearheads of the American advance and buy time for a reconsolidation of the German position. The problem was that the plan was based on assumptions that were no longer true. The decision to launch Lüttich originated from a man who had not seen the battlefields of Normandy and who was receiving information filtered through a command structure that had every reason to present an optimistic face to its leader. Hitler's military advisors, particularly those at OKW, the High Command, had counseled caution, but their arguments had been overridden by Hitler's characteristic conviction that if only the will to attack could be restored to the German army, the situation could yet be reversed. The experienced commanders in Normandy knew better. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had assumed overall command in France, was skeptical of the plan's feasibility. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who would command one of the panzer corps involved, later testified that he believed the operation was futile from the moment he received the orders. The generals understood what Hitler either did not or would not accept. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in the skies over Normandy. The American Air Force was operating with near total freedom, and German panzer divisions were being consumed far faster than they could be replaced. A major offensive operation requiring days of exposure to enemy air attack was not a calculated risk. It was a recipe for catastrophe. Yet orders were orders, and when Hitler's directives arrived, the machinery of military obedience set itself in motion. The attack would be launched from the Mortagne area, with the aim of driving westward toward Avranches and the sea. The 5th Panzer Army would coordinate the thrust, with SS panzer divisions playing a central role in the spearhead. 4 panzer divisions, including elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, were assigned to the operation. The attack was set to begin on the 6th of August, 1944. The German forces assembled for the offensive had been battered by weeks of fighting, but they still possessed formidable striking power. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, had been reinforced with additional companies of Panthers and Tigers. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, despite the losses it had suffered in the fighting around Saint-Lô, still fielded a respectable complement of armoured vehicles. Supporting them were 2 Wehrmacht panzer divisions, the 2nd Panzer and the 17th Panzer, plus numerous infantry divisions in supporting roles. On paper, the concentration of armour was impressive. On the ground, the situation was different. Many of the panzer divisions were operating at reduced strength due to the constant pressure of the previous weeks. Vehicle serviceability was down, fuel supplies were uncertain, and most critically, there was no possibility of maintaining the kind of air superiority, or even air parity, that such an operation would require. The American Air Forces knew nothing, of course, about Lüttich before it began, but within hours of the first German movement, they knew everything that mattered. The planning sections of the 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force received their target lists, and the intelligence staffs passed them to combat squadrons already ranging over Normandy. American fighter bombers, operating from fields just behind the invasion beaches, could be over the Mortagne sector in minutes. Strategic bombers could rain destruction on German assembly areas. And most devastating of all, the American Air Forces could strike with virtual impunity, because the Luftwaffe could no longer challenge them for control of the skies. The German offensive began in darkness before dawn on the 6th of August. Under cover of pre-dawn mist, panzer columns moved forward toward their objectives. The initial thrust caught the American forces in the sector by surprise, and for a few hours, it seemed as though the German counterattack might achieve its breakthrough. American positions were overrun. German tanks advanced several kilometers to the west. But as dawn broke and the mist lifted, the skies above the German columns began to fill with American aircraft. Wave after wave of fighter bombers descended on the advancing panzers. Thunderbolts and lightnings raked the columns with cannon fire. Medium bombers dropped their ordnance on concentrations of German vehicles. The German counterattack, which had begun with such promise, was rapidly disintegrating into a nightmare of destruction and confusion. For panzer crews and infantry riding on tanks, the experience was apocalyptic. There was nowhere to hide in open country. against an enemy that controlled the air. Tanks and half-tracks burned, columns fragmented into isolated clusters, trying to find cover under whatever trees and buildings they could reach. The German commanders tried to press forward despite the air attacks, knowing that the longer they delayed, the more time the Americans would have to consolidate their defenses and bring in reinforcements. But the losses mounted with each hour that passed, and the ultimate objective of reaching the coast seemed increasingly remote. The Americans, for their part, reacted to the German offensive with a combination of surprise and determination. The initial breakthrough in the Mortagne sector had caught some units off guard, but American commanders quickly grasped what was happening and began to react accordingly. Rather than retreat or consolidate defensively, they moved to reinforce the threatened sector, while simultaneously allowing the German panzer divisions to advance deeper into terrain where they could be surrounded and destroyed. It was a calculated decision based on a principle that American commanders had begun to understand. The more aggressively the Germans attacked, the more exposed they made themselves to encirclement. The focus of the German offensive increasingly centered on a hill that would become the symbol of American resistance during the operation. Hill 317 overlooked the Mortagne sector and the roads leading westward. If the Germans could seize and hold it, they would have a dominant position from which to control the terrain around them. If the Americans could hold it, they would anchor the northern flank of the American position and prevent the Germans from widening their breakthrough. The fight for Hill 317 became a focal point of desperate intensity. American infantry, equipped with anti-tank guns and supported by artillery, dug in and prepared to defend the position against German panzer and infantry assaults. German units, their commanders aware that the success or failure of the entire operation might depend on taking this single piece of high ground, attacked repeatedly. The fighting on the slopes of Hill 317 became a microcosm of everything that was wrong with the entire Lüttich operation. German courage and determination meeting American firepower and determination, with the advantage increasingly going to the side that could bring the most weight of metal onto the field. The defense of Hill 317 by American troops became the stuff of legend in the annals of World War II operations. A company of American engineers, originally assigned to construct roads and clear obstacles, found themselves defending against repeated German attacks. They had limited ammunition, no armor support, and nowhere to retreat. What they had instead was a commanding position, excellent fields of fire, and the knowledge that the fate of the entire American drive through France might rest on their ability to hold that ground. Air support proved critical. American fighter bombers, responding to requests from forward air controllers with the American infantry, struck German assembly areas and concentrations at point-blank range. Artillery fire, orchestrated by American forward observers, rained down on German positions. German attacks went in at full strength and returned decimated. The hill changed hands multiple times over the course of several days of fighting, but the Americans, reinforced by additional troops brought up through the breakthrough sector, managed to maintain their hold on the position. The German failure to seize Hill 317 was more than a tactical defeat. It was a symptom of a larger problem. Lüttich had already failed. The German columns driving westward had advanced perhaps 40 kilometers before the American air superiority and the emerging threat of encirclement had forced a pause and then a retreat. The breakthrough was not developing into the decisive thrust that had been envisioned. Instead, the German forces committed to the operation were becoming increasingly exposed to the possibility of being cut off from the east by American and Canadian forces driving south. As the operation unfolded, Senior German commanders began to realize, with increasing clarity, that they were committed to a catastrophe. General von Kluge, commanding the German forces in France, sent increasingly urgent messages to OKW, explaining that the operation was failing and that unless the panzer divisions were withdrawn from the Mortain salient, they would be surrounded. But Hitler, receiving reports that filtered out the grim reality and amplified the minor successes, was convinced that the operation could still succeed if only the will to attack could be maintained. He refused to permit a withdrawal. The German panzer divisions, strung out in an increasingly thin salient pointing westward, were told to hold fast and prepare for a renewed offensive. They were instructed to attack again once they had reorganized, but reorganization was proving impossible when every hour brought fresh waves of American air attacks, when supplies were running short, and when the Americans were clearly moving forces into position to cut off the entire salient at its base. The German commanders in Normandy recognized what was happening. They were being ordered to walk into a trap, and they did not have the authority to refuse. For the Waffen-SS divisions committed to Lüttich, the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer divisions, the operation represented both the height of the offensive power they could project and the beginning of their destruction. They were excellent soldiers, fighting under skilled commanders, but they were being asked to accomplish an operation that was militarily impossible against an enemy that possessed overwhelming superiority in the air, the capacity to move reinforcements faster than the Germans could reorganize, and the strategic position to permit the Germans to advance further before closing the trap. The broader context of Lüttich was a question of intelligence and will. The Americans, through ultra-intelligence, the decryption of German Enigma traffic, had advance warning of the German intention to attack. They had known the general outline of the operation before it began. This knowledge had not made them invulnerable to the initial German thrust. Surprise and the weight of German armor could still cause casualties and dislocation, but it meant that American commanders had time to prepare a response, to position reserves, and to plan the encirclement that was beginning to take shape as German forces drove deeper into the salient. The German commanders, meanwhile, were operating with poor intelligence about American movements and American strength. They did not know that American forces were already moving to close the gap between the northward driving American columns and the southward driving Canadian and British forces that were descending from the Caen area. They did not know that additional American divisions were being brought up to the breakthrough sector. They were operating in a kind of strategic fog, in which their perceptions of the situation bore only a passing resemblance to the actual disposition of forces. This gap between perception and reality would become the gulf into which the Lüttich operation would sink. The SS Panzer divisions involved in the Lüttich operation experienced the offensive as a progression from initial breakthrough to recognition of disaster. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, under Sepp Dietrich, threw its divisions into the fight with the kind of ferocity that the Waffen-SS was renowned for. But ferocity, courage, and tactical skill could accomplish only so much when the basic strategic situation was hopeless. American air power, which had been a background factor in the Normandy campaign, became in Lüttich an all-consuming reality. German panzer crews and infantry experienced the sensation of being hunted from the sky by an enemy they could not see, could not reach, and could not defend against. The discipline of the German forces held, and organized retreat began once it became clear that the offensive was spent. But the retreat was not orderly. It was the beginning of a fragmenting collapse. German units attempting to withdraw found their routes of escape increasingly threatened by American mobile forces moving to cut them off. The salient that had seemed to promise a German breakthrough was transforming into a potential Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle from which the Germans would struggle to escape. The failure of Lüttich was not a sudden event. but a progressing realization, hour by hour, that the operation had never had a chance of succeeding, and that German forces were now in greater danger than they had been before the offensive began. By the second week of August, it was becoming clear that Lüttich had run its course. German forces, severely battered by weeks of continuous combat and by the relentless air attacks that had characterized the operation, had failed to reach the coast and had failed to cut off the American breakout. Instead, they had overextended themselves into a salient where they were vulnerable to encirclement. The question that now occupied the minds of German commanders was not how to renew the offensive, but how to escape the closing trap. Field Marshal von Kluge, acutely aware that he was being blamed by Hitler for the failure of an operation he had never believed in, was attempting to maneuver forces to maintain an escape route eastward. The Waffen-SS divisions, along with the Wehrmacht formations that had fought at Mortain, were beginning their withdrawal from the salient. But the Americans, smelling blood, were moving to close the exits. The encirclement that had been a possibility was becoming a probability. The operation that had been intended to save the German position in Normandy had instead accelerated its collapse. The courage and tactical skill of German soldiers could not overcome the weight of American superiority in arms. In the case. By the 12th of August, 1944, the geometry of the Normandy campaign had shifted in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could reverse. The American breakthrough at Operation Cobra in late July had torn open the German front west of Saint-Lô, and armored columns were now racing southward and eastward, no longer grinding through hedgerows in small increments, but flowing across open terrain in search of the sea. The German command, fractured and increasingly detached from reality, had committed its reserves to the counterattack at Mortain in the first days of August, throwing SS Panzer divisions and Wehrmacht formations into an offensive that experienced commanders already knew was doomed. But Hitler had ordered it, and so it was executed. The result was catastrophic. As American forces pushed their columns toward Alençon and beyond, and as Canadian and Polish forces drove southward from Caen toward Falaise, the two jaws of an encirclement began to close around nearly two entire German armies. Trapped between those jaws was a seething mass of more than 100,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns, thousands of vehicles, and the SS Panzer divisions that had so dominated the close fighting of the previous weeks. The pocket that would bear Falaise's name was never a neat military concept, but rather a widening catastrophe that developed across several days of breakneck movement and diminishing options. By the 12th, the northern jaw, composed of Canadian and Polish forces, had pushed past Falaise itself, moving toward Trun and Chambois. The southern jaw, composed of American and French forces, had swung eastward from Alençon toward Argentan and beyond. The gap between them, the escape corridor, narrowed by the hour. Through this corridor poured the remnants of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, a desperate exodus of vehicles, men, and equipment that had been shattered and scattered across the Norman bocage for more than 2 months. The SS Panzer divisions, once the cutting edge of German defense, were now tasked with the far grimmer job of holding open that gap long enough for the wreckage of two armies to flow through it. There was no glory in this fighting, no possibility of breakthrough or counterattack. There was only the grim mathematics of how many men could be saved before the pocket collapsed entirely. The escape corridor through Falaise was never a single route, but a congested ribbon of roads that became a killing ground the moment the encirclement began to tighten. The roads from Normandy's interior toward the east and northeast became choked with traffic that moved in fits and starts, accelerating when the way seemed clear and grinding to a halt when news of airborne troops or tank columns ahead filtered back through the column. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend bled down to perhaps 1,500 combat troops from its original strength of more than 20,000, fought a series of rearguard actions north of the pocket, holding defensive positions around villages like Gassé and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. These were not the coordinated divisional operations that had characterized the fighting around Cannes, but rather desperate clusters of SS troops and remaining tanks holding a hamlet here, a crossroads there, buying hours for the columns to move. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, likewise shattered and scattered, committed its survivors to similar rearguard fights in multiple locations, aware that delay was all they could offer, and that delay would cost them dearly. Kurt Meyer, who had inherited command of the Hitlerjugend after Fritz Witt's death, was now one of the youngest division commanders still in the field, and the responsibility that had fallen upon him was the hardest imaginable. The strategic collapse was beyond any officer's power to reverse, yet the survival of his division, or what remained of it, depended on his tactical decisions in the next days. Meyer made the choice that many experienced officers made in those final days of the pocket: preserve the remaining men and equipment by withdrawing through the gap in small groups, rather than committing them to futile last stands. This decision, which would later become a point of controversy in post-war investigations, was born of realism rather than cowardice. Holding to the last man at every position would have meant the complete annihilation of the division without any compensating advantage. Moving scattered groups through the chaos offered at least some chance of survival. Meyer established holding positions at key points, but explicitly authorized subordinates to break off and move through when encirclement seemed imminent. This adaptation to catastrophe was what the SS commander did best when conventional warfare had become impossible. The roads through the escape corridor became a hell of their own character. Panzers and self-propelled guns, caked in dust and trailing smoke, lurched forward in single file down narrow country roads designed for farmers' carts, not military convoys. Behind them, trucks and half-tracks carried wounded men, some sitting silently and staring into nothing, others crying out for medics who had long since run out of morphine and bandages. Horses, still a significant part of the German army's transport, were driven in panicked herds, some falling from exhaustion and being left where they lay. The air was filled with the grinding of damaged engines, the shouting of NCOs trying to maintain some semblance of order, and the constant drone of Allied aircraft. Every few kilometers brought news of another roadblock ahead, another column halted, another delay measured in lives. Some units made it through the gap. Others, caught by armored thrusts or simply overwhelmed by the sheer density of enemy forces that seemed to materialize from every direction, did not. The SS Panzer divisions that had fought with such ferocity in the weeks before now fragmented into small battle groups and company-sized elements, each fighting its own battle for survival. The combat around the tightening corridor took on an almost surreal quality in the final days before complete encirclement. Polish forces, fighting under General Stanislaw Maciek, pushed south toward Chambois, with a determination born partly from rage. Reports of SS atrocities against Polish prisoners had spread through the Allied armies, and partly from the simple military logic of closing a gap before it became impossible. The Canadians, similarly motivated by knowledge of the crimes committed against their own soldiers at Normandy, fought with particular intensity to cut off the escape. The Americans, driving from the south, moved more cautiously, perhaps because they had not endured the same intensity of close fighting, or because their officers were more concerned with not being ambushed than with racing to close a net. But close it did. By the 16th of August, the gap had narrowed to a corridor only a few kilometers wide. By the 17th, Panzers attempting to break through were being destroyed at point-blank range by anti-tank guns and tank destroyers positioned on rising ground overlooking the roads. By the 18th, the pocket was nearly sealed, though stragglers and small groups continued to slip through for another 2 days. The SS units holding the perimeter of the escape corridor in these final days of the encirclement fought with a mixture of skill and desperation that would characterize all German resistance in the war's final phases. Panzer commanders, trained in combined arms tactics and coordinated defense, now found themselves directing platoons from farmhouses or woods, attempting to hold roads with ammunition running low and replacements non-existent. Anti-tank gunners dug into positions overlooking the escape routes became islands of resistance, holding their fire until tanks were nearly on top of them before opening up. Infantry dug in around the villages of Chambois, Troon, and Exmes, fought hand-to-hand with Polish and Canadian troops, gaining ground only to lose it minutes later to the next assault. One of the most bitter fights came at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, where SS and Wehrmacht troops made repeated attempts to break through Canadian and Polish positions that held the high ground overlooking the village. The fighting there lasted nearly 40 hours without pause, with both sides counter-attacking and defending in turn, until the village changed hands multiple times in a single day. By the end, the roads around Saint-Lambert were littered with burned-out tanks, abandoned vehicles, and bodies that no one had time to count. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, which had been withdrawn from the Caen sector weeks earlier and committed to the Mortain counterattack, found itself caught in the eastern part of the pocket as the encirclement closed. Under the command of Willy Bittrick, an officer more intelligent and less ideologically committed than many SS commanders, the division fought a structured withdrawal rather than attempting suicidal breakouts.